The boy didn't run. Every instinct a 9-year-old owns should have told him to run. But Ethan Brooks planted both feet in the dirt, spread his thin arms wide, and placed his entire body between the looming rancher and the small bundle of food his sisters were clutching behind him. His voice didn't shake when he spoke. "Please don't take our food, mister." He swallowed hard. "We saved all day for this." Samuel Walker, a man who hadn't felt anything in 20 years, felt something crack open inside his chest that he would never be able to close again. Before we go any further into Ethan's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now. Tell me what city you're watching from today, because this is a story about what happens when one man decides that 4 children and their mother are worth more than his solitude. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. The summer of 1884 had been brutal to Central Texas, in the particular way that only Texas summers know how to be: relentless, unforgiving. The kind of heat that doesn't just sit on a man's shoulders, but presses down through them, through his spine, through the soles of his boots, and into the cracked earth below. Samuel Walker had worked that heat for 30 years. He understood it the way a man understands an old enemy, not with fear, but with a tired, mutual respect. He was 50 years old, and he looked every hour of it. His hands were the hands of a man who had never once asked for help, wide across the palm, scarred at every knuckle, darkened by decades of sun and fence wire and cattle rope. His face carried the same story, deep lines at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that had been set hard for so long the muscles beneath it had forgotten any other shape. Gray threaded through his dark hair at the temples, heavier now than it had been the year before, and his shoulders, still broad and still square, carried a weight that had nothing to do with the physical labor of running a cattle ranch alone. Samuel Walker had been alone for 19 years. Not alone the way a man is alone on a long trail ride where the solitude is temporary and sweet and ends at a campfire. Alone the way a house is alone when everything living inside it has gone. The kind of alone that doesn't announce itself anymore because it has simply become the permanent condition of a life. The people of Harlan County knew him. They knew his name, knew his land, knew the quality of his cattle, and the reliability of his word in a business deal. Beyond that, they knew nothing, because Samuel Walker had made certain there was nothing beyond that to know. He didn't attend Sunday services. He didn't come to the Harvest Social or the Founders' Day celebration, or the dances held in the church hall on warm Friday evenings, when the whole county seemed to pour itself into laughter and fiddle music. He bought what he needed at Callaway's dry goods store, exchanged the minimum words required to complete the transaction, and rode back to his land. His ranch hand, a quiet older man named Doss, had worked the Walker property for 11 years and knew better than to ask personal questions. Doss showed up, did the work, collected fair pay, and went home. It was an arrangement that suited both men perfectly. That was the shape of Samuel Walker's life in the summer of 1884. Then, on a Thursday evening in the last week of July, everything changed. He had finished the day's work late, later than usual, because one of the fence lines along the eastern pasture had given way, and 3 steers had gotten through into the dry creek bed, and rounding them back up in the fading light had tested what remained of his patience. He was walking back toward the main house when he heard it. At first, he thought it was a fox. The sound was small, furtive, almost nothing. A soft scraping, a quiet rustling from somewhere behind the barn, near the pile of old fence posts and discarded lumber he'd been meaning to clear out for 6 months. Samuel slowed his step without stopping. He tilted his head, listening the way a man does when he isn't sure what he's hearing. He heard it again. He changed direction. What he found behind the barn stopped him where he stood. 4 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. A boy, lean and sun-darkened, with serious eyes that were far too old for his face. He was crouched over a small cloth bundle that had been laid out on a flat piece of wood, hardly a table but treated like one, and he was dividing something among the 3 smaller figures huddled close beside him. A younger boy, maybe 6, with the same dark eyes. 2 girls, one perhaps 7, one small enough that Samuel guessed she was barely 4. Her hair in 2 uneven braids that someone had done their best with. They had scraps, Actual scraps. Kitchen scraps. The kind of things that get thrown out behind a cookhouse without a second thought. Some bread that had gone hard. A chicken bone with almost nothing left on it. A few bruised peaches that had fallen from the tree along the south fence and rotted most of the way through. The older boy was dividing these things with the focused, serious care of someone performing a sacred task. And none of the smaller children made a sound as they waited. Samuel's boot heel caught a dry piece of wood as he rounded the corner of the barn. The crack of it split the quiet evening air like a pistol shot. All 4 children froze. Then 3 of them scrambled backward, the younger boy, the older girl, the little one, pressing themselves against the barn wall with their eyes wide and their breath coming fast and shallow. The oldest boy did the opposite. He rose to his feet, turned to face Samuel directly, and spread both his thin arms out to his sides deliberately, like a barrier, like a fence line, placing himself between the man and his siblings, and the small, sad collection of food they'd gathered. His chin came up. "Please don't take our food, mister." The boy's voice was steady, steadier than it had any right to be. "We saved all day for this." Samuel Walker stood entirely still. He was a man who had ridden through cattle stampedes and survived a drought that killed half the county's livestock in a single season. He'd sat across a table from men who meant to cheat him and stared them down without blinking. He had buried his father and his mother and the last piece of his old life in a single terrible year, and he had kept standing. He was not prepared for this. The boy didn't flinch. He held his position with the steady resolve of someone who had made a decision and was not going to move from it, not for size, not for authority, not for anything. Behind him, the little girl had pressed her face into her older sister's shoulder, but the sister was watching Samuel with the same careful, measuring look as her brother. "I ain't." Samuel's voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw from a day of shouting across open pasture. He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. "I ain't taking anything." The boy didn't lower his arms. "Ethan?" The younger girl, the one who was maybe 7, pulled at her brother's sleeve. "Ethan, he might be telling the truth." "Hush, Lily," the boy said without looking away from Samuel. "Your name's Ethan?" Samuel asked. A pause, then a careful nod. "How long have you children been out here?" "Nothing." "I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said. The words felt strange in his mouth, not because they weren't true, but because he couldn't remember the last time he'd had to say anything like them. "I just want to know how long you've been on my property." Ethan's jaw tightened. Behind him, the little one, the youngest girl, peeked out from her sister's shoulder. She had enormous dark eyes and a smear of dirt across her nose. And when she looked at Samuel, she didn't look frightened the way the others did. She looked curious. "We didn't take nothing," Ethan said. "We only took what was already thrown away, things nobody wanted." "I know," Samuel said. "We didn't break anything or steal anything." "I know that too. So you got no call to send us anywhere." The boy's voice carried the edge of someone who had rehearsed this argument many times over, who had anticipated exactly this confrontation and had prepared himself for it. "We ain't causing trouble, we're just—" He stopped. "Just what?" Samuel asked quietly. Ethan's arms dropped, just slightly, just enough to betray how exhausted they were from holding the position, how much the bravery was costing him. "We're just trying to eat," the boy said. Samuel looked at the 4 of them for a long moment. The scarred, careful collection of scraps on their makeshift table, the worn-through soles of the younger boy's shoes. The way the oldest girl, Lily, she'd been called, kept one arm firmly around the little one, even now, even with Samuel standing still and speaking quietly, a habit so ingrained in her body that she probably didn't notice she was doing it. He turned around and walked back to the house. He heard Ethan's sharp intake of breath behind him, heard the boy whisper something fierce and quiet to his siblings, some instruction about being ready to run, and Samuel kept walking. Through the back door, into his kitchen. He stood there for a moment. Then he built a fire in the stove. He heated the last of the morning's bread until it was warm all the way through. He sliced it and wrapped it in a clean cloth. He found the roasted chicken he'd been planning to eat for supper, most of it still good, and wrapped that too. He went out back and pulled 6 peaches from the tree that grew along the south fence. Ripe ones. The kind that gave when you pressed them lightly. He filled a canteen with clean water. He carried all of it out and set it under the mesquite tree on the east side of the barn. Not right where the children were, not close enough to crowd them or corner them, but visible, obvious, unmistakable in its intention. Then he went back inside, turned the lamp low, and sat at his kitchen table. He didn't go back out to watch. He didn't stand at the window. He simply sat in the quiet of his house and listened. And after a while, he heard the soft sound of children moving through the dark, careful, quick, the sound of small feet on dry ground, and then the settling quiet that meant they had found what he left and taken it somewhere safe. Samuel sat alone at his table for a long time that night. He couldn't have named what he was feeling. He hadn't practiced feeling things in so long that the experience was almost entirely foreign to him, like trying to read a language he'd once known as a boy and had spent 20 years forgetting. Something in his chest was different. Something had shifted. Some internal weight that had been sitting in one place for 19 years had moved just slightly, just enough to notice. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a plate of food under a mesquite tree was a simple act of human decency, the same thing any reasonable person would do, and it meant nothing beyond that. He believed this almost all the way to sleep. The next morning, Doss arrived at the usual hour and found Samuel already at the fence line with a post digger. They worked through the morning without much talk, which was normal. Around mid-morning, Doss tilted his hat back and said, without looking up from the wire he was stretching, "You know there's young'uns on the property." "I know," Samuel said. "Been there a few days, I'd reckon. Maybe more." "I know," Samuel said again. Doss was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you planning to do about it?" Samuel drove the post digger into the ground. "Nothing," he said, "for now." Doss nodded like this made complete sense, because Doss was a man who had learned that Samuel Walker's nothing often meant considerably more than it sounded. That afternoon, Samuel found a piece of paper tucked into the split of the fence post nearest the barn. Someone had drawn on it, a rough crayon drawing, the kind a young child makes, all color and instinct and no particular discipline. In the drawing there was a tall, dark figure standing beside what was clearly meant to be a mesquite tree, and under the tree there were 4 small figures. And around all of them, the child had drawn the sun in enormous yellow rays that took up most of the page. Below the drawing, in careful, slightly crooked letters, the handwriting of someone who was still learning but trying very hard, were 4 words. "Thank you, quiet cowboy." Samuel stood at the fence post, holding that piece of paper for a long time. He folded it in half. He put it in the chest pocket of his work shirt. He went back to the fence line. That evening, he left food again. More this time, enough for several days. He included a blanket because the night before had been unseasonably cool, and he'd lain awake thinking about whether they had enough covering wherever they were sleeping. He included a small bottle of the liniment he kept for cuts and scrapes, a bar of soap, and one of the old oil lamps he kept in the back of the storage room with a tin of oil beside it. He didn't look to see if any of it was taken. He already knew it would be. What he didn't know, what he was still very carefully not allowing himself to think about, was the question of who these children belonged to and why they were alone, and how long this arrangement was going to last before the rest of the world noticed and arrived with opinions about what ought to be done. In Harlan County, the rest of the world always arrived eventually, and in Samuel Walker's long experience of the world, it rarely arrived with good intentions. He found her on the 4th day, not by searching. Samuel Walker was not a man who went looking for trouble, and he had spent the better part of 3 mornings convincing himself that what he didn't know couldn't require anything of him. But the 4th morning broke differently. He was up before the light, the way he always was, and he was crossing the yard to the water pump when he heard it. Not the children this time, not the small, careful sounds of young feet trying not to be noticed, but something else entirely. A sound low and controlled, and deliberately quiet. The sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard, crying. He stopped walking. The sound was coming from the abandoned equipment shed on the north side of the property, the one he'd meant to tear down 3 seasons ago and hadn't, because there was always something more urgent to do with his time and energy. And the shed wasn't hurting anything, just standing there with its rotting boards and its tilted roof and its general air of something that had been given up on. He stood still for a long moment. Then he walked toward the shed. He didn't announce himself. He didn't knock on the broken door that hung at an angle from one remaining hinge. He simply pushed it open slowly and stood in the doorway. And the woman inside spun around so fast she knocked over the small tin cup she'd been drinking from, and water spread across the dirt floor between them. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s maybe, though hard living had put something older behind her eyes. Dark hair pulled back tight, a plain gray dress that had been mended so many times the patches had patches. Hands that were raw at the knuckles from work. She put herself in front of the sleeping children, all four of them curled together on a pile of blankets in the corner. The old blanket he'd left under the mesquite tree spread over the top of them, and she lifted her chin at him with an expression that Samuel recognized instantly because he had worn it himself more times than he could count. It was the face of someone who was terrified and absolutely refusing to show it. "Ma'am," he said, "I know we're on your land." Her voice was controlled, quiet, so as not to wake the children, but there was iron in it. "I know we have no right. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or make excuses for it." She swallowed. "But I am asking you, as one human being to another, to give me until the end of the week. I have written to my husband's brother in San Antonio, and I am expecting a reply. We will be gone before Sunday. I give you my word." Samuel looked at her. "How long have you been in this shed?" he asked. Something shifted in her face. Not weakness, not quite, but the particular strain of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and is being asked to describe its weight. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. The shed had no floor to speak of, just packed dirt. The roof had at least 2 places where daylight showed through. The summer nights in central Texas dropped to a temperature that felt merciful compared to the days, but was still no place for a 4-year-old child to sleep without proper shelter. 6 weeks, Samuel repeated. "We managed," she said, and the way she said it told him exactly how much managing it had taken and how little she wanted his sympathy for any of it. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause, then, "Sarah Brooks. My children are Ethan, Jacob, Lily, and Rose." "Mrs. Brooks," Samuel said. "My name is Samuel Walker. This is my ranch." He stopped, looked at the 4 sleeping children, looked back at her. "I left the food," he said. Her composure nearly broke then. It didn't. She was too practiced at not letting things break, but he saw it, the way her jaw shifted and her eyes went briefly bright before she pulled them back under control. "I know," she said. "I told the children not to take it. Ethan didn't listen." The faintest trace of something that wasn't quite a smile. He rarely does. "Good," Samuel said. He was right not to. She studied him for a moment, measuring something. "You're not going to make us leave?" she asked. "Not today," he said. He left before she could respond because he had reached the end of what he knew how to say, and he was not a man who spoke past that point. He went back to the house. He made a full breakfast, more than he'd made for himself in years, more than he could have justified eating alone, and he carried it to the shed on a proper tray, with a cloth over it to keep the heat in. He set it on the crate outside the shed door and walked away without waiting to see what she did with it. He heard the door open behind him. He heard her voice, quiet and careful. "Mr. Walker." He stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and kept walking. That was how it started. Not with grand declarations or dramatic moments, with a breakfast tray and a woman too proud to break down, and a man too unused to softness to know what to do with what he was feeling. He started leaving supplies in a more organized way after that. Not just food, but things a family actually needed. Candles, a proper lamp, more blankets. He found an old cot in the storage room and dragged it to the shed without telling her he was going to, and when he came back in the evening, it had been moved inside, and she had left a folded piece of paper on the crate where he'd taken to setting things. He opened it. It was a list, written in the most careful, precise schoolteacher's handwriting he had ever seen, of everything she had taken from him, with a column beside each item labeled, "What I will repay when I am able." Every item. Even the ones he'd thrown away that the children had taken before he started leaving things deliberately. He stood there in the fading light reading that list for a long time, Then he folded it and put it in his chest pocket beside the drawing Ethan had left him, and he went inside. He was not prepared on the following morning for what the town already knew. He rode into Harlan for supplies on a Wednesday, and Calloway met him at the counter with a look that told Samuel something had already been said before he walked through the door. 3 other men were positioned at various points in the store, with the studied casualness of people who had been waiting for him to arrive. "Morning, Walker," Calloway said. "Morning. Here you've got some folks camping out on your north acreage." Samuel set his list on the counter. "I'll need everything on that. A woman and 4 young'uns, from what I understand. The flour first, if you've got it," Samuel said. Calloway leaned forward slightly. "That woman's husband died owing debts all over this county, Samuel. There are men who have legitimate claims against whatever she's got left. You taking her in creates complications." One of the other men, Garrett Holt, who owned the feed store and had the disposition of someone who had never once in his life gone hungry, pushed off from the wall he'd been leaning against. "It ain't just about debts," Holt said. "You've got a single woman living on your property with 4 children and no husband. People are going to talk. They already are talking." Samuel looked at Holt. "Then they've got more time than sense," he said. "Those kids might be better off separated," said the third man, and Samuel couldn't remember his name but recognized the type immediately. The kind of man who used words like "better off" when he meant more convenient. County could place them with proper families, give them a real start. Something went very still in Samuel Walker. "Say that again," Samuel said quietly. The man blinked. "I'm only saying the children could be." "Those children," Samuel said, his voice dropping lower than conversation, "are exactly where they need to be. And I'll tell you something plainly, so there's no room for misunderstanding later." He picked up his list from the counter. "I own 340 acres in this county. I pay my taxes, and I pay them on time. I have never, in 30 years, asked this town for a single thing." He let that sit for a moment. "As long as I own that land, no one, not you, not the county, not anyone else with more opinions than business, is moving those children anywhere. We clear?" The store was very quiet. Calloway cleared his throat. "I'll get your flour," he said. Samuel rode back to the ranch with the wagon loaded and the knowledge sitting heavy in his gut that the conversation in Calloway's store would be repeated in every parlor and supper table in Harlan County before the week was out. He'd made a declaration in public, which meant it was binding in ways that went beyond his own intentions. He'd put himself between that family and the town was going to push back, and he was going to have to hold the line. He hadn't entirely decided to do this before he walked into that store. He decided it in the moment Holt said the word separated. He pulled the wagon around to the shed and was unloading the supplies when Ethan appeared from nowhere, the way the boy always did, soundless and sudden, as if he materialized out of the air, and without a word picked up a sack of cornmeal nearly as big as his torso and started carrying it toward the shed. "You don't have to do that," Samuel said. "I know," Ethan said, and kept carrying. They worked in silence for a few minutes, Samuel handing things down from the wagon, Ethan ferrying them inside with a seriousness that made him seem 40 years old. And then Samuel said, without planning to, "Anybody in town been bothering your mother?" Ethan set down a crate of canned goods and looked up at him, those old eyes in that young face. "Mr. Patterson tried to talk to her outside the church last week," he said. "Told her she needed to make arrangements for us. Said he knew families that would take us in." "What did she say?" Ethan picked up the crate again. "She told him that her children weren't arrangements to be made, and that she'd die before she let anyone separate us." He paused at the shed door. Then she smiled at him like everything was perfectly fine and walked away. Samuel looked at the shed door for a moment after the boy went inside. He picked up the next crate. He thought about a woman who had been living in an equipment shed for 6 weeks, who kept precise accounts of everything she'd been given so she could pay it back, who told a man trying to separate her family that she'd die first, and then smiled. He didn't know what to make of Sarah Brooks. He knew he was starting to want to. Sarah herself appeared that evening when he was checking the water supply line near the shed, appeared the way she tended to, without warning, as if she'd been waiting for a moment when he couldn't easily walk away from a conversation. "Ethan told me what you said in town," she said. Samuel kept his attention on the waterline. "Did he?" "He tells me most things," she said. "Usually things I didn't ask him to report on." She paused. "What you said about nobody moving the children, you didn't have to do that." "No," Samuel agreed. "You've already done more than anyone had any right to expect of you." He looked up at her then. She was watching him with that careful, measuring expression she seemed to wear whenever she was trying to figure out where he actually stood, as if his position might shift without warning, and she needed to be ready. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "I've lived on this land my whole life. I've watched this county judge people for things that were none of their business and call it community concern. I've watched families get broken apart for the convenience of people who didn't have to live with the consequences." He looked back at the waterline. "I'm not interested in being another person who looks the other way." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't know us," she said. "Not an accusation, an observation. You know almost nothing about us." "I know Ethan carried a sack of cornmeal bigger than he was without being asked," Samuel said. "I know your youngest follows me around the yard like she's taking notes. I know Lily sings when she thinks nobody's listening." He paused. "And I know Jacob has been watching me fix this water line for 3 days from behind the shed corner. And one of these mornings, I'm going to hand him a wrench and let him help, if that's agreeable to you." Something happened in Sarah Brooks's face that she couldn't entirely control. It wasn't quite crying, it wasn't quite smiling. It was something between the two, something private and involuntary that she pressed her lips together to contain. "That would be agreeable," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "He loved to help his father with things. He's been—" She stopped. "He needs that." Samuel nodded. He stood up, wiping his hands on his work cloth, and he was about to say something practical about the water line when little Rose, 4 years old, braids already coming undone by mid-morning, completely unconcerned with the concept of appropriate timing, pushed through the shed door, crossed the distance between them at a determined trot, and attached herself firmly to Samuel's left leg. "Cowboy!" she announced, looking up at him with absolute confidence. "Rose," Sarah said, in the tone of a woman who has said a particular child's name in a particular tone approximately 10,000 times. "Let go of Mr. Walker's leg." Rose considered this instruction seriously. Then she tightened her grip. "She's all right," Samuel said. He looked down at the small person attached to his leg, who was looking back up at him like he was something she had decided to keep. And for a moment, just a moment, Samuel Walker felt something so foreign and so enormous that he couldn't name it, couldn't contain it, couldn't manage it the way he managed everything else in his life. He reached down and carefully, awkwardly, set his large, scarred hand on top of her head. Rose beamed. Sarah watched this with the expression of someone witnessing something she hadn't believed she would see again. The next morning, the town made its first real move. 3 men rode out to the ranch before breakfast. Holt from the feed store, Patterson from the church, and a man named Croft who handled county administrative matters and had the look of someone who had arrived with paperwork and a prepared speech. Samuel met them in the yard before they could get close to the shed. "Walker," Croft said, "we've had some concern raised about the situation here formally." "Is that so?" Samuel said. "The woman is a widow with no legal claim to this property and no means of support. The children are potentially at risk. The county has procedures." "She's a guest on my property," Samuel said. "I invited her." Croft blinked. "I wasn't aware." "I'm making you aware now," Samuel said. "She and her children are here at my invitation, which makes this a private matter on private land. You got paperwork that says otherwise, you go get a judge to sign off on it and come back. Until then, you're standing on my property without an invitation, and I'd ask you to correct that." The 3 men looked at each other. Holt said, "This isn't over, Samuel." "I didn't imagine it was," Samuel said pleasantly. "Safe ride back to town." He stood in the yard and watched them go. Behind him, from the direction of the shed, he heard a sound he hadn't expected. A small, quiet sound that he needed a moment to identify because it had been so many years since he'd been close enough to a child to hear it. It was Rose, laughing. She was standing in the shed doorway watching the men ride away, and she was laughing the way 4-year-olds laugh when something delights them for reasons they couldn't explain if asked. Purely, completely, without reservation. Samuel turned around. Rose pointed at the retreating horses and looked at him with eyes full of absolute certainty. "They going away," she said. "They are," Samuel said. "Good," said Rose, with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. And Samuel Walker, who had not smiled in longer than he could accurately remember, felt the corners of his mouth move in a direction that surprised him entirely. He didn't stop it. For the first time in 19 years, he didn't stop it. The smile didn't last long. 3 days after Croft and his men rode away from the ranch, Samuel was in town picking up wire when he heard it. Not directed at him, not meant for his ears. The particular kind of conversation that happens in the gap between two buildings when people believe they're alone. Holt's voice, low and certain, talking to Patterson about a letter that had already been sent. Not to the county this time, to the state. Samuel kept walking. He didn't let on that he'd heard. He finished his business at the hardware store, loaded the wire into the wagon, and rode back to the ranch with his jaw set and his mind working through what that letter likely said, and who it was likely addressed to, and how much time he probably had before whatever it set in motion arrived on his doorstep. The answer, by his best calculation, was not much. He found Sarah at the water pump, washing out a shirt that belonged to Jacob. The boy had gotten into something tar-based along the fence line that morning, following Samuel the way he'd taken to doing, handing tools and watching everything with those quiet, hungry eyes that reminded Samuel of himself at that age in ways that made his chest ache. She wrung out the shirt without looking up when she heard his boots on the dry ground. "You've got something on your mind," she said. "Always do," Samuel said. "This is different." She looked up then. Whatever she saw in his face made her set the shirt down on the pump handle and give him her full attention. What happened in town? He told her, all of it. Holt's voice in the gap between buildings, the letter, his best guess at what it meant, and how long they had. He told it straight without softening any of it, because he had learned in the past 3 weeks that Sarah Brooks did not want things softened. She wanted the truth delivered at full weight so she could figure out what to do with it. And he respected that more than he knew how to say. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "How serious is it?" "Serious enough," Samuel said. "A state-level inquiry into the welfare of children on private property. They'll send someone. Could be a marshal, could be a welfare officer if the county's got one, which I'm not certain it does. Either way, when they come, they'll have authority I can't simply ask to leave." "When," she said, not if. "When." "When," he confirmed. Sarah picked up the shirt again, wrung out a section that didn't need wringing, and stared at the water running off her hands. "I should take the children and go," she said, "before it gets worse, before it brings more trouble down on you." "No," Samuel said. She looked at him. "Running doesn't fix it," he said. "Running just means they've won without having to do the work. And the next place you go, there'll be another Holt, and another Patterson, and another letter. You run now, you'll be running forever." He held her gaze. "I've got a lawyer in Austin I've done land business with for 15 years. Man named Hargrove. I'm going to write him tonight, and I'm going to ask him what legal ground we're standing on and what we can do to make it solid." Sarah was very still. "You do that," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Already decided it," Samuel said, "just telling you so you know." Something moved through her face, that complicated thing she did when emotion got close to the surface, and she managed it rather than let it run. She turned back to the pump and resumed her work, but her hands had changed. They were steadier than they'd been a moment before. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Samuel," he said. He wasn't entirely sure why he said it. He'd been Mr. Walker his entire adult life, and he'd never once asked anyone to change that. "Samuel," she said, and the word sat differently in the air than anything else she'd said to him. "Whatever Hargrove tells you, whatever this costs, I need you to know that I will pay back every penny of it, every cent. It may take years. It will take years, but I will." "I know you will," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it." He walked back toward the house before she could ask him why he was doing it, because he wasn't entirely certain he had an answer that would make sense to either of them. The letter to Hargrove went out the next morning on the early mail. Samuel wrote it at the kitchen table before sunrise by lamplight, choosing his words carefully, the way he chose everything, without waste, without decoration, with exactly the weight required and no more. He laid out the facts. He asked the right questions. He sealed it and handed it to the mail writer at the road, and then went back to work, because the work was always there, and it was the one thing he knew how to do without doubt. What he did not expect was what happened that afternoon. Ethan came to find him at the south pasture, running, which was unusual, because Ethan was not a boy who ran unless the situation required it, and arrived at the fence line slightly breathless with something in his hand. "Letter came for Mama," he said, "from San Antonio." Samuel went still. He had nearly forgotten about the letter Sarah had mentioned that first morning in the shed, the one she'd written to her husband's brother before she'd known that Samuel knew they were there. The one she'd been expecting a reply to. "She already read it?" he asked. Ethan nodded. His expression was hard to read. The boy had inherited his mother's talent for keeping his face arranged, but he was 9 years old, and 9 has limits. "She's in the shed," he said. "She's not crying, but she's doing the thing she does when she's trying not to." Samuel left the fence. He knocked on the shed door frame. The door still hung at its angle. They'd adapted to it, and Sarah said, "Come in," without looking up from the letter in her hands. She was sitting on the cot, the paper held flat across her knee, and she had the composed, deliberate stillness of a woman who had already made some decision and was working out the details of living with it. "The brother," she said. "Daniel." She smoothed the edge of the letter with her thumb. "He says he's sorry for our trouble. He says he's praying for us." A pause. "He also says he has 4 children of his own and a 5th on the way, and that he regrets he's not in a position to take on additional family at this time." Samuel said nothing. "He wished us well," Sarah said, very sincerely. She folded the letter with precise, careful movements. "So, that's that." "Sarah." "I'm all right," she said. Her voice was absolutely level. I wasn't certain he would say yes. I was hoping, but I wasn't certain." She set the folded letter on the blanket beside her. "I just need a minute to rearrange some things in my head, and then I'll be fine." Samuel sat down on the crate across from her without asking permission. She looked at him, slightly surprised by this. He had never sat down in the shed before, had always conducted any conversation from the doorway, with one foot essentially still outside. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Samuel, I mean it. You and the children are staying on this property for as long as you need to. That's not negotiation, and it's not charity. It's just a fact I'm telling you. Hargrove will tell us how to make it legal and airtight, and whatever he says to do, we'll do it. But I need you to stop looking for a door out of this situation. Stop trying to find a way to make this somebody else's problem to solve." She stared at him for a moment. "Why?" she asked. And the way she asked it was not defiant. It was genuinely puzzled. The question of someone who had been let down enough times that they'd stopped trusting kindness at face value. "Why does it matter to you? You didn't know us 6 weeks ago. You didn't owe us anything then, and you don't owe us anything now. So why?" Samuel thought about this. He turned the question over the way he turned a problem over, seriously, without rushing, giving it the weight it deserved. "Because Ethan stood between me and his sisters," he said finally, "with nothing but his own 2 arms and the decision that he was not going to let anything happen to them. And I recognized something in that." He paused. "I recognized it because I used to know how to do that. Stand between something I cared about and whatever was coming for it." He looked at his hands. "I forgot how, for a long time. I think I'd like to remember." The shed was very quiet. Outside, they could hear Rose talking to the cat that had appeared from somewhere along the fence line 3 days ago and had immediately adopted the children as its permanent responsibility. Lily's voice, slightly older, answering her sister in the patient tone of someone who had been answering Rose's questions since before she could properly walk. Jacob, somewhere further off, making the sound of a boy trying to be very quiet about something he was doing. "You had someone," Sarah said, not a question. "Before. Someone you stood between and the world." Samuel nodded. "What happened?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll tell you that story someday," he said. Not today. Today I need you to trust me enough to stop planning your exit and let me deal with Holt and Patterson and whoever they've written to in Austin." She looked at him for another long, measuring moment. Then she nodded, one small, deliberate nod. "All right," she said, "but I'm not going to stop keeping accounts of what you've given us." "I know," Samuel said. "I'd expect nothing less." He stood up and was at the door when she said his name, said, "Samuel," the way she had at the pump, with that particular weight. He turned. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the supplies, not for the lawyer, for—" She stopped, looked for the word. "For sitting down." He understood what she meant. He nodded, and he went back to the fence line. The reply from Hargrove arrived 11 days later, and it was not simple reading. Samuel went through it 3 times at the kitchen table, tracing the logic of it carefully, and then he rode into town to the telegraph office and sent 2 messages. One back to Hargrove with follow-up questions. One to a county records clerk he'd done business with in Austin whose name Hargrove had provided. He was back at the ranch by mid-afternoon, and he went directly to find Sarah. "There's a legal mechanism," he told her, standing in the yard outside the shed, with Jacob hovering at the edge of his peripheral vision, the way the boy always did when something important seemed to be happening. "It's called a formal residency arrangement. Hargrove says if I document your presence here as an established working arrangement, if we set it up properly with your labor contributing to the ranch operation in a documented way, it creates a legal basis that's much harder to challenge than simple charity." Sarah's eyes sharpened. "What would that look like?" "You taught school," he said before. 7 years, she said. "Doss's wife has been trying to get a lending library started in town for 2 years. Woman named Abigail Turner has been pushing the same thing from the church side. Neither of them has anybody with the background to organize it or run it. And neither of them has the books." "Books? I've got about 400 books in the house that haven't been opened in 15 years. My mother's collection." Sarah stared at him. "If you were running a legitimate community lending library operating out of this ranch," Samuel said carefully, "that's a community contribution. That's documented civic purpose. It changes the nature of what you're doing here from trespassing to service. And it gives Hargrove something to work with legally." The silence stretched. 400 books, Sarah said. "Give or take. I haven't counted recently." She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. She was working through it. He could see her doing the mental architecture of it, testing the structure from different angles, the way she did with every important thing. Then something shifted in her face, something that was, for the first time in his presence, close to hope. Real hope, not the managed, rationed, careful kind she'd been allowing herself in small doses, but the larger, more dangerous kind. "The children could help," she said. "Ethan can catalog. Lily has been practicing her letters every day she could." She stopped. "I'm getting ahead of myself." "No," Samuel said. "Get ahead, plan ahead. That's what we need." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "When can I see the books?" He led her to the house for the first time. Through the back door, through the kitchen, where she glanced at everything quickly and cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. Down the hallway to the front room, where the shelves covered 2 full walls, floor to ceiling. His mother's careful collection, accumulated over 30 years, organized by subject in her neat hand. Sarah stopped in the doorway. She didn't speak for a moment. "My word," she said softly. "Take whatever you need," Samuel said. "Take all of it if it's useful." She turned to look at him, with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, completely unguarded. The careful management gone for just a moment, something open and real and unprotected in its place. Then the front door crashed open. Ethan, breathless, white-faced, nothing at all like his usual controlled self. "There's a man at the gate," the boy said. "He's got a badge." Samuel moved past him immediately, out the front door and down the porch steps, and he was halfway across the yard before he heard Sarah behind him. She'd followed closer than he expected, and Ethan was right at her shoulder. The man at the gate was young, younger than Samuel had expected, maybe 30, with a federal marshal's badge and the look of someone who was trying to project more authority than he entirely felt. He had a document in his hand. "Samuel Walker," he said. "That's right," Samuel said. Marshal Aldous Webb, out of Austin. I've got a welfare inquiry document here regarding children reported to be living on this property in conditions of— "Let me see that," Samuel said. Webb blinked. "Mr. Walker, I'd like to read what I'm being presented with before anyone continues speaking," Samuel said, and held out his hand. Webb, after a pause, handed it over. Samuel read it slowly, thoroughly. Webb shifted his weight. Behind Samuel, he could hear Sarah standing completely still, that particular stillness she got when she was holding something in very tightly. He finished reading. He handed the document back. "Marshal Webb," he said. "Those children are the family of my formerly employed household staff, living on this property at my explicit invitation and contributing to a documented community service operation. I have legal counsel in Austin, a man named Hargrove, you may know his firm, who has been advising this arrangement for 3 weeks. I'd suggest you telegraph Hargrove's office before you take any further action, because whatever that document says, the legal ground you're standing on is considerably less solid than whoever wrote it believed." Webb looked at the document, looked at Samuel, looked at Sarah. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you here of your own free will?" "I am," Sarah said. "And your children are safe? Fed, sheltered, learning. More than I can say for where we were 6 months ago." Webb looked at Samuel again. Something in his young face was working through a calculation. "I'll telegraph Austin," he said. "If your lawyer's story checks out, Mr. Walker, I won't have cause to proceed further." "That's all I'm asking," Samuel said. Webb tipped his hat to Sarah specifically, which Samuel noticed, and rode back toward town. Samuel stood at the gate until the dust settled. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the ordinary quiet of the ranch yard, a low, distant rolling that had nothing to do with thunder, because the sky directly overhead was clear. He turned instinctively, scanning the horizon, and he saw it in the northeast. A column of smoke, dark and heavy and moving fast, lit orange at its base where it met the dry hills. His whole body went cold. "Samuel," Sarah's voice, very controlled, which meant she'd seen it too. "Get the children," he said. "Get them now. Everything you can carry in your arms. Move." She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She turned and ran toward the shed, calling the children's names, and Samuel ran for the barn where Doss kept the water barrels and the beating sacks and the things you needed when fire crossed dry Texas hills in the wrong direction at the end of the driest summer in a decade. The wind shifted. He felt it on his face, felt it change direction with the sudden, indifferent certainty of weather. And he understood immediately that what had been moving away from them was now moving toward them instead. He started running faster. The fire moved the way fire always moves in Central Texas at the end of a dry summer, without mercy and without hesitation, feeding on everything the drought had prepared for it. Samuel had the water barrels on the wagon in 4 minutes. He knew because he counted. Counting was the thing his mind did when panic tried to get in. A habit built over 30 years of emergencies that required clear heads and fast hands. 4 minutes for the barrels, 2 more for the beating sacks and the long-handled shovels. He was hitching the second horse when Doss appeared from the direction of the east pasture at a dead run, which Samuel had never once seen the man do in 11 years. "Northeast fence line's already gone," Doss said, not breaking stride, swinging up onto the wagon seat beside Samuel. "Wind's pushing it southwest. If it hits the dry creek bed, it'll jump, and we won't be able to stop it." "How long?" Samuel said. 20 minutes, maybe less." Samuel looked toward the shed. Sarah had all 4 children out, Rose on her hip, Jacob and Lily pressed close on either side. Ethan slightly ahead of the group the way he always positioned himself, scanning the smoke with the face of someone calculating distances. Samuel drove the wagon toward them. "Get in the back," he told Sarah. "All of you." "Where are we going?" Ethan asked. "Colton's place, 2 miles east. The fire's moving southwest, so east is safe. Get in, son." Ethan got in. He helped his brother and sisters in after him, then held out his hand for his mother. Sarah passed Rose up first, then took Ethan's hand and climbed in. She settled Rose between herself and Lily, wrapped one arm around Jacob, and looked at Samuel. "Go," she said. He drove. He got them 1.5 miles out before Ethan made a sound behind him. Not a word, just a sharp intake of breath that cut through the noise of the wagon and the wind and the distant roar of the fire. Samuel glanced back. The boy's face had gone the color of ash. "The box," Ethan said. His voice was strange, hollow. "Mama, the box." Sarah turned to look at him. Something passed across her face. "I left it," the boy said. "I left it in the shed." "Mama, I left Papa's picture. The photograph." Samuel knew about it. Sarah had mentioned it once in passing, the way people mention the things that matter most when they're trying to speak casually about them. The only photograph of Thomas Brooks, taken the year before he died, the only one they had. The one Ethan had carried from their house in a tin box the day the bank came and took everything else. "It's all right," Sarah said, and the effort it cost her to say it steadily was visible. "It's all right, sweetheart. It's just a picture." "It's not just a picture," Ethan said. He wasn't crying. His voice was harder than it had been. "It's the only one. It's the only thing we have left of him." He started to stand up in the moving wagon. Samuel pulled the horses to a stop. Everyone looked at him. He handed the reins to Doss without a word. "Samuel!" Sarah's voice, sharp, immediate, with something in it he'd never heard from her before. Something close to fear, the real kind, not the managed kind. "Samuel, don't!" He was already down from the wagon. "Keep driving east," he told Doss. "Don't stop until you reach Colton's. I'll follow on foot when I can." "The fire," Doss started. "I know where the fire is," Samuel said. "Drive." "Samuel," Sarah's voice again, different now, lower. He turned to look at her and found her eyes on him, not with the measured, careful expression she usually wore, but with something open and direct and frightened in a way that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with him specifically. "Please don't," she said. He held her gaze for a second. "Take care of them," he said. He turned and ran back toward the ranch. He heard the wagon moving behind him. He heard Rose crying, the sudden alarmed cry of a small child who understood that something was wrong without knowing exactly what. He heard Ethan's voice, tight and wrecked, calling after him. He put all of it behind him and ran. The smoke was already thick when he hit the ranch yard. His eyes were streaming before he reached the shed. The fire hadn't jumped the creek bed yet. Doss had been right about the timing, barely. But he could feel the heat of it from 50 yards away. A physical pressure against his face and chest, like a door being pushed against him from the other side. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth and went into the shed. The tin box was exactly where Ethan had described it. Under the cot, pushed against the wall, a small dented thing with a wire latch light as almost nothing when he grabbed it. He was back out of the shed in under a minute, the box in his hand. Then the wind shifted again. He heard it before he felt it. A change in the roar of the fire, a deepening, a surge, and then the heat hit him from a completely different direction, and he understood that the creek bed had gone. The fire had jumped. What had been a threat from the northeast was now a presence on 3 sides, and the path he'd run in on was already lost in smoke so thick he couldn't see 10 feet ahead. He moved on instinct. He knew this land the way he knew his own hands, every fence line, every ditch, every dry wash and slight rise. He moved through the smoke by memory, by feel, by the 30 years of his feet knowing this ground. He went down into the shallow gully behind the barn, where the dirt was damper and the grass had never grown in properly, dropped flat when a wall of heat rolled over him, pressed his face against his arm and waited. 4 seconds, then pushed up and kept moving. He came through the fire line on the south side. He didn't know how. He was never entirely certain afterward. There were gaps in the next few minutes, places where the sequence of events blurred at the edges. He knew his left arm was burned. He knew the box was still in his right hand. He knew he was on the ground at some point, and then he was not on the ground. And then there was open air and the sound of someone shouting his name. Doss. Doss had come back. The older man grabbed him by the good arm and pulled him upright, and they half ran, half stumbled away from the fire line until they were far enough out that the air was mostly breathable again. Samuel stopped and put his hands on his knees and coughed for a long time. "You got it?" Doss said, looking at the tin box. "I got it," Samuel said. Doss looked at Samuel's left arm, looked at his face. "You look terrible." "Feel it too," Samuel said, and straightened up. The Colton farm was another half-mile. They walked it. Samuel held the tin box in his right hand the whole way and did not think about his left arm, because thinking about it would not improve it, and there were more important things to do with his attention. He heard Rose before he saw them. The little girl came running across the Colton yard the moment she spotted him, not with the careful, deliberate trot she usually employed, but at full 4-year-old velocity, arms out, completely committed, and she hit him at knee height and wrapped herself around his legs and said his name the way she always said it. That single declarative word. "Cowboy!" He reached down and picked her up with his right arm, the tin box pressed between them. She buried her face in his neck and held on. Over her head, he saw Sarah. She was standing 20 feet away, and she had stopped walking when he picked Rose up. She was looking at him with an expression that she was making no effort whatsoever to manage or contain. Something raw and real and entirely unguarded on her face. Something that the careful, composed woman he'd come to know over these weeks had never once let him see before. She crossed the distance between them. She stopped in front of him and looked at his arm, and her jaw tightened. And then she looked at his face, and then she looked at the tin box. "You went back for it," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He held the box out to her. She took it with both hands, held it, pressed it flat against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. Behind her, Ethan was watching from the porch of the Colton house with Jacob beside him. The boy's face, when Samuel looked at him, had gone entirely through something, gone through and come out the other side of it. Some profound, private reckoning that had happened behind those serious eyes in the time it took Samuel to run to the ranch and come back. Ethan walked down the porch steps. He crossed the yard. He stopped in front of Samuel with the box now back in his mother's hands, and he looked up at him. And for a moment, the boy with the old eyes and the wide arms and the voice that didn't shake was simply 9 years old. Simply a child who had been carrying too much for too long, and had just watched a man run into fire to save the last thing he had of his father. "Thank you," Ethan said. His voice broke on the second word. Just slightly, just enough. Samuel put his right hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's what family does," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out of him the way true things sometimes come, not from thinking, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere below thought. Some place in him that had been gradually filling up over the past weeks without his full awareness, and had finally reached the point of spilling over. Ethan stared at him. Then the boy did something Samuel had not expected. He stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Samuel's chest. Samuel wrapped his right arm around him and held on. Neither of them said anything else. The fire burned for 2 more days. When it was over, Samuel rode back to the ranch with Doss to take stock of the damage. The shed was gone entirely. The north fence line needed complete replacement. The barn had caught at one corner, but Doss and 2 of the Colton boys had beaten it out before it spread. The house was intact. The mesquite tree, the one Samuel had left food under that first night, was scorched along one side, but still standing. He stood in the yard and looked at it. He thought about a 9-year-old boy with his arms spread wide. He thought about a woman who kept accounts so she could pay back every cent. He thought about what he had said to Ethan without planning to, and whether or not he had meant it, and realized the question answered itself immediately. He had meant every syllable of it. He had meant it more completely than he'd meant almost anything he could remember saying in the last 20 years. The news of what he'd done traveled fast. It traveled the way news travels in small counties, imperfectly, with embellishment, but with the essential truth intact. Samuel Walker had run back into a fire on the wrong side of a jumped creek bed to save a dead man's photograph for 4 children who weren't his. By the time he rode into Harlan 2 days after the fire to speak with Hargrove's associate about the legal paperwork, the shape of the story had already done something to the atmosphere of the town that Samuel hadn't anticipated. Abigail Turner stopped him on the street. She was a small, direct woman in her 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to organizing other people, and the grace to do it without making them feel organized. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I want to help. Whatever that family needs." "Tell me what they need." They need a place to stay while the shed gets rebuilt, Samuel said, then stopped, reconsidered. Actually, they're staying in the house. I moved them into the house 2 days ago. Abigail blinked. Oh, she said, and then with a very small smile, well then I suppose they need everything else. Furniture, proper bedding, clothing for the children, books for the library Mrs. Brooks is going to run. You heard about that? Samuel said. I helped come up with it, Abigail said. Hargrove's associate is a friend of my husband's. Samuel, half this town wants to help and doesn't know how. Let me organize them. That's what I'm good at. He thought about this for a moment. Tell them to start with the fence line, he said. I've got posts, but I'm short on wire, and I could use hands. She nodded and was already moving. What happened over the following week was something Samuel would not have predicted if he'd been asked to forecast it. It arrived without announcement and without his asking, men showing up at the ranch with tools and wire and working the fence line from first light. Women coming with food and bedding and clothing for the children. The church sent lumber. The hardware store sent supplies at cost. Even Calloway, who had looked at Samuel with that complicit expression the morning Holt and Patterson were there, came out with his 2 sons and worked a full day on the barn corner without saying much except that he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner. Samuel accepted all of it without ceremony, because these were people doing what they should have done to begin with, and the right response to that was acknowledgement, not absolution. He let them work. He worked alongside them. He noticed that the men who came were, without exception, men who had kept quiet when others spoke. Not the Holts and the Pattersons, but the ones who'd stood in the background with their mouths closed and their consciences apparently active. Sarah ran the house with the same focused competence she brought to everything. She organized the meals that the women brought, made sure the children were helpful and not underfoot, kept Lily from reorganizing the book collection according to her own system, which differed significantly from the original. She had moved the 400 books from the front room to the larger back room off the kitchen and begun cataloging them with Ethan in the evenings, and Samuel, passing the doorway, had watched the 2 of them bent over a handwritten ledger with the oil lamp between them, working with the comfortable concentration of people who were doing exactly what they were suited for. It was on the 5th evening after the fire that Hargrove's associate arrived in person. His name was Merritt, and he was a lean, precise man in a town suit who looked out of place on a cattle ranch, but had the practical, unsentimental manner of someone who spent his professional life cutting through complications. He sat across from Samuel and Sarah at the kitchen table. The children had been sent outside, which Ethan complied with only after giving Samuel a look that communicated clearly that he knew he was being managed. Merritt spread 3 documents on the table. The welfare inquiry has been dropped, he said. Webb filed a report recommending closure after his visit. Apparently, what he observed here did not match the description in the original complaint, and he said so in writing. Samuel said nothing. Sarah said nothing. The legal arrangement for the library operation is solid, Merritt continued. As documented, Mrs. Brooks functions as a staff member of the Walker Ranch with documented community service responsibilities. That's airtight. He paused, picked up the 3rd document. There's a 3rd matter. Hargrove asked me to discuss it with you in person because he felt it was the kind of thing that required a human conversation rather than a letter. He set the document on the table between them. Samuel looked at it, looked at Merritt. It came to Hargrove's attention during the process of establishing the residency documentation, Merritt said carefully, that there is an existing legal record relating to you, Mr. Walker, from approximately 20 years ago, regarding a land contract. Something went still in Samuel's face. The woman's name, Merritt said quietly, was Clara Voss. She signed a land contract with you in 1864, which you honored in full. She subsequently provided testimony in a county property dispute that characterized the arrangement as having been made under your misrepresentation. That testimony was false. Hargrove's research has established that clearly. The kitchen was very quiet. Sarah was looking at Samuel. He was not looking at anything in particular. His face had the expression of a man who has just been told that a wound he thought was his fault was not his fault, which is not always a simple thing to receive, because the ownership of that wound has become part of the structure of who you are. And having it taken away means something in that structure has to shift. She lied, Samuel said. His voice was flat. Deliberately and for financial advantage, Merritt said. The record is clear. I believed her, Samuel said. For 20 years, I believed her account of what happened. I know, Merritt said. He gave that a moment of proper space. Hargrove wanted you to know that you have legal remedy available if you choose to pursue it. The record can be formally corrected. The false testimony can be struck. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Sarah had not moved. She was watching his face with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered, not trying to fill the silence, just present in it with him. Strike the record, Samuel said finally. I don't need the remedy. I just need the record corrected. Merritt nodded, made a note. Mr. Walker, he said, and something in his professional manner warmed slightly. For what it's worth, Hargrove has known you for 15 years. He asked me to tell you that he's glad this came to light. After Merritt left, Samuel and Sarah sat at the kitchen table without speaking for a few minutes. Outside, they could hear the children, Rose narrating something elaborate to the cat, Lily's music from around the corner of the house, Jacob and Ethan in what appeared to be a debate about fence post spacing that had gotten surprisingly intense. 20 years, Sarah said finally. 20 years, Samuel said. She looked at her hands on the table, then back at him. You've been carrying that for 20 years, and it wasn't yours to carry. He didn't say anything. Samuel, she said, and then, I'm sorry. Not for the practical matter of it, for the years, for what it cost you. She held his gaze. You deserved better than that. Whatever anyone told you about yourself as a result of what that woman did, it wasn't true. He looked at her for a long moment. I know that now, he said. And the strange, enormous thing was that he meant it, not as an aspiration, not as something he was working toward, but as a present, actual fact settling into him with the solidity of something that was going to stay. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He read the room with the accuracy of someone who had been reading rooms out of necessity his entire life, and he said, Is everything all right? Everything's all right, Samuel said. The boy nodded, leaning in the doorway for a moment. Then, Rose wants to know if you're going to have supper with us tonight, or if you're going to eat alone in the kitchen again. Samuel looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Samuel. Tell her I'll be there, Samuel said. Ethan's face did something quick and controlled and not quite hidden, and he disappeared back out the door. Samuel stood up from the table. For the first time in 20 years, the weight he'd been carrying was not in the room with him. He went to have supper with his family. That first supper as a family changed something in the house that no amount of repair work on the shed or fence line could have accomplished. The cracks in the walls still showed on cold mornings. The kitchen floor still sloped slightly toward the back door, where the foundation had settled unevenly over 30 years of Texas weather, and the stove still smoked when the wind came from the north. But none of that mattered because the sound of the house was not the sound of a man eating alone in the dark anymore. The sound of the house at supper was Rose asking questions so fast she barely finished one before starting the next. Lily describing the catalog system she was building for the library with such precision that even Samuel, who had only learned the alphabet from his mother at this very same table, could follow it. Jacob recounting every single thing he had learned about post-setting that day in exhaustive detail that made Ethan roll his eyes, but not unkindly. And Sarah, at the far end of the table opposite Samuel, watching all of it with the expression of a woman who had not expected to have this again, and was still learning how to hold it without breaking. The morning after that supper, Samuel woke before sunrise the way he always had, but the silence that greeted him was different. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the sounds of a house that was no longer empty, the creak of floorboards from the room where the children slept, the murmur of Sarah's voice already up and moving in the kitchen, the soft thump of whatever Rose had dropped on the floor, with the innocent carelessness of someone who had not yet learned that objects could break. Samuel sat up and looked at his left arm. The burn from the fire was healing, but it had been wrapped in clean linen that Sarah had insisted on changing twice daily. The skin beneath pulled when he moved, a tight reminder of that run through the smoke. He flexed his fingers. They worked. That was enough. He pulled on his shirt and walked into the kitchen. Sarah was at the stove with her back to him, and Rose was already seated at the table with a piece of bread in one hand and the cat Biscuit crammed into her lap, with the air of a creature that had resigned itself to being loved whether it wanted to be or not. Sarah turned when she heard his boots. She looked at him for a moment, and then, without a word, she set a plate on the table beside Rose's spot. Eggs, bacon, a slice of the bread she had made the day before from flour the Turner sisters had brought. Samuel sat down. Rose looked at him with her enormous dark eyes and announced, "Biscuit slept on my head last night." "Did he?" Samuel said. "His tail was in my mouth," Rose said with the gravity of someone reporting a significant event. Sarah made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but close to it. "I told you not to leave the window open." "He wanted in," Rose said simply, as if that settled all questions of responsibility. Samuel picked up his fork. He ate breakfast at his own table, with a 4-year-old on one side and the cat curled on the floor by his feet, and he listened to the sound of the other children waking in the back rooms. And he thought that this was what his mother must have meant when she used to say that a house was not a house until it had people in it who needed each other. The days that followed had a rhythm that Samuel had not experienced since his childhood. Up before dawn, but now there was coffee already made when he came in from the barn. Work on the fence line. But now there were 2 boys beside him, Jacob with his quick hands and endless questions, and Ethan with his quiet watchfulness and his way of anticipating what needed to be done before Samuel asked. Lily worked inside with her mother on the library catalog, and Rose appointed herself the official greeter of every visitor who came to the ranch, which was more than Samuel had ever had in any single year of his life. Men arrived to help with the fence, as Abigail Turner had promised, and women came with baskets of food and bolts of fabric and offers of anything else that might be needed. The town's mood had shifted. The fire had done what Samuel's words in the store had not. It had made the family real to them, not an abstraction, not a problem to be solved, but a mother and 4 children who had lost everything, and a rancher who had run into the flames to save a dead man's photograph. But not everyone had shifted. Samuel saw Holt in town on a Thursday morning when he went to pick up the wire that Calloway had ordered special from Austin. Holt was standing outside the feed store with 2 other men, and when Samuel rode past, Holt's eyes followed him with the fixed attention of someone who was not finished. Samuel did not stop. He conducted his business and rode home, but he made note of it, the way a man makes note of a fence post that has started to lean. Not an immediate problem, but one that would become one if left unaddressed. The school letter arrived on a Saturday. It came by messenger, a boy of about 14 on a tired mule who handed Samuel an envelope with the official seal of the Harlan County School Board, and then waited for a reply, because he had been instructed not to leave without one. Samuel opened the envelope standing in the yard. He read the letter once, then again, and then he walked into the house where Sarah was at the kitchen table with Lily, going over the library ledger. She looked up at his face and set down her pencil immediately. "What is it?" Samuel handed her the letter. She read it. Her jaw tightened in that particular way he had come to recognize, the way she held herself when she was deciding how much emotion to allow into the room. "It's from the county school superintendent," she said, more to herself than to him. "They're requiring the children to be enrolled in the Harlan school within 30 days, or they'll open a formal inquiry into the adequacy of their education." "That's what it says," Samuel confirmed. Lily looked between them, her eyes wide. "Mama, are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Sarah said, but her voice was not entirely steady. "We're not in trouble. We just need to figure something out." Samuel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "The school in Harlan is 5 miles each way. That's a long walk for Rose, and it's not a cheap enrollment. They charge per child." "I know," Sarah said. She was still looking at the letter. "I taught in that school for 2 years before I married Thomas. I know the superintendent. He's a fair man, but he follows the rules to the letter." "Then we'll enroll them," Samuel said. Sarah looked up at him. "Samuel, that's 4 enrollments. That's more than—" "I heard what I said." He reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he had done that without a reason, without an emergency or a moment of crisis, simply because he wanted to. Her fingers were cold from holding the paper. "I've got the money. The ranch has had a good year, even with the fire, and those children are going to get an education. We can't keep taking from you." "You're not taking." He held her gaze. "We're family. That's what I said to Ethan in the middle of that fire, and I meant it. Family doesn't keep accounts." Sarah's eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together. Then she pulled her hand back gently and folded the letter with precise movements. "We'll talk about it tonight," she said, which was her way of saying that she needed time to adjust to the idea of accepting something she hadn't earned, and Samuel understood that, because he had spent 19 years being the same way. That afternoon, Ethan came to find him at the new fence line. Jacob was with him, carrying a coil of wire that was nearly too heavy for his frame, but the boy insisted on doing the carrying himself. Ethan had a different look on his face than usual, something careful, something that told Samuel a conversation was coming. "Jacob," Ethan said, "go check the post holes on the north line. I think one of them might have settled wrong." Jacob looked at his brother, then at Samuel, then back at Ethan. "You're just trying to get rid of me." "Yes," Ethan said. Jacob shrugged and headed north with the good-natured acceptance of someone who knew his place in the hierarchy and was not troubled by it. When he was out of earshot, Ethan turned to Samuel. "I heard about the school letter," he said. Samuel did not ask how. "Your mother tell you?" "Lily told me," Ethan said. "Lily tells me everything. It's her way of processing." Samuel nodded. He waited. "I don't want to go to school," Ethan said. The words came out flat, without the heat of rebellion, but with the weight of something deeply felt. "I'm 9 years old. I know how to read and write and do sums. My mother taught me. And I'm more useful here. I can work. I can help with the cattle. I can." "You're 9 years old," Samuel said, repeating the boy's own words back to him. "You're a child. You're supposed to be in school." "I've been taking care of my family for 2 years," Ethan said. His voice was still flat, but the edge was beginning to show. "I've been the man of the house since my father died. I know how to do things that other boys my age don't. I know how to stretch a ration of flour to last a week. I know how to patch a roof so it doesn't leak. I know how to—" "You know how to survive," Samuel said, "and you did a fine job of it. But you don't have to survive anymore. You're allowed to be a boy now." Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked away, toward the horizon where the smoke from the fire had long since cleared and the grass was beginning to show the first green hints of recovery. "I don't know how to be a boy," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I forgot." Samuel set down the post digger. He walked over to where Ethan stood and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The same shoulder he had held in the Colton yard after the fire. "I know," he said. "I forgot how to be something else, too. I forgot how to be anything besides a man, alone on a piece of land. But I'm learning. And you can learn too. It takes time." Ethan's shoulders were shaking, but he was not crying, not yet. "What if I can't?" "Then you try again the next day," Samuel said. "That's what learning is. You fall down, you get back up, you try again. And you don't have to do it alone anymore." The boy stood there for a long moment. Then he let out a breath that seemed to carry something out of him, something heavy that he had been holding since before Samuel ever met him. "I don't want to go to the school in town," he said. "The kids there, they'll look at me like I'm something broken." Samuel thought about this. "Then we'll find another way," he said. "We'll figure it out together." That evening after supper, Sarah and Samuel sat on the porch while the children played in the yard. The sun was low, the air was cooling, and the cat was stretched out on the railing like a creature with no concerns at all. Sarah had a cup of coffee that she had not yet drunk. She was turning it in her hands, watching the steam rise and disappear. "Ethan talked to me," she said. "He talked to me too," Samuel said. "He doesn't want to go to school here." "I know." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about it all day," she said. "Not just about the school, about everything. About the fact that you have given us everything we have, and I don't know how to repay it. You don't have to." "I know you say that," she said, not sharply, but with a firmness that told him she needed to finish. "I know you mean it. But I need you to understand that it matters to me. It matters to me that I am not a burden, that I am contributing, that I am—" She stopped. Samuel waited. "I was a good teacher," she said. "Before I married, before the children, I was a good teacher. The best in the county," they said. "I could teach any child to read, even the ones the other teachers had given up on." She looked at him. "What if I taught them here? What if I started a proper school on the ranch? Not just the library, but a real school. I have the training. I have the books. The children in town who can't afford the enrollment fee, they could come here. The county would have to approve it. But if I could show them that the education was equal to or better than what they offer in town—" "You want to start a school," Samuel said. "I want to earn my place," she said. "I want to build something that belongs to me, to us, to this family. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Samuel looked at her. The light from the setting sun caught the side of her face, and for the first time he noticed that the tightness around her eyes, that had been there since the day he found her in the shed, had loosened. She was still carrying weight. She would always carry weight. That was who she was. But she was no longer carrying it alone. "Then we'll build it," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "We've got the space, we've got the books, and we've got you. I don't know what the county will say, but we'll fight them if we have to." "What if they say no?" she asked. "Then we'll find another way." He paused. "That's what we do now. We find another way. Together." She set down her coffee. She took his hand. Her fingers were warmer now. "I married him when I was 19, she said. "Thomas. I loved him more than I knew how to say. He was kind and steady, and he made me feel safe. When he died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would never feel safe again." She looked at their hands, together on the porch railing. "I didn't expect to find it again." "I didn't expect to find you." Samuel did not know what to say to that. He had spent so many years not saying things that the muscles for speaking from the heart had atrophied. But he squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and that was enough. The next morning, Samuel rode into town to see the school superintendent. His name was Barnes, a man in his 60s with a white beard and the patient expression of someone who had spent 40 years managing the chaos of children and had learned to let very little surprise him. He listened to Samuel's proposal without interrupting, reading the letter that Sarah had written overnight explaining her qualifications and her plan. When Samuel finished, Barnes set the letter on his desk and leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Brooks is an excellent teacher," he said. "I remember her work. She could get results that bordered on the miraculous. I have no doubt she could run a school on your property that would meet every standard we have." He paused. "But there is a complication." "Let me guess," Samuel said. "Holt." Barnes did not confirm it, but he did not deny it either. "There are members of the school board who have concerns about a woman of her situation operating an independent educational institution. They're concerned about moral standing, about the influence on other children, about—" "She's a widow," Samuel said. "She's raising 4 children. She's never done a dishonest thing in her life." "I know that," Barnes said. "But the board requires a vote, and certain members have indicated that they will oppose the measure." "Then I'd like to speak at the meeting." Barnes looked at him for a long moment. "That's your right," he said. "The next board meeting is in 10 days. I'll put you on the agenda." Samuel rode home with the date fixed in his mind. 10 days to prepare. 10 days to convince a room full of people who had already made up their minds. He had faced worse odds. He had faced a fire on 3 sides with nothing but a wet bandana and a tin box. This was different. This was not a fight against nature, which he understood. This was a fight against men who had decided that a woman who had lost everything did not deserve a chance to rebuild. He told Sarah that evening. She listened without comment, and when he finished, she said, "I'll be there too." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, but I will. If they're going to decide our future, they're going to have to look me in the eye while they do it." Samuel nodded. He had expected nothing less. The 10 days passed in a blur of work and preparation. Sarah wrote a detailed curriculum. Lily helped her organize the books into teaching sets. Ethan, still reluctant about the school idea but no longer actively resisting, helped Samuel repair the old storage shed that had survived the fire and could serve as a classroom. Jacob built desks, rough, functional but solid, from lumber that the church had donated. Rose contributed by drawing pictures to hang on the walls, which were included in the classroom design, whether anyone asked for them or not. The night before the board meeting, Samuel could not sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind move through the cottonwood trees outside his window, and he thought about what he would say. He thought about the look on Holt's face when he had said those children would be better off separated. He thought about Ethan's arms spread wide in the dark. He thought about Sarah's hand in his on the porch. He thought about the photograph in the tin box, the one he had run through fire to save. And he thought about what it meant to be a family that was built, not given. He did not have a prepared speech. He had never been a man of prepared speeches. But he knew what he was going to say. He had known it for weeks, maybe since the moment he first saw those children behind the barn. The next morning they rode into town together, Sarah in the wagon with the children, Samuel on his horse beside them. The whole family. The whole family together, facing whatever came next. The school board met in the back room of the town hall, a cramped space with a long table and chairs for the board members and a few benches for the public. The room was full when they arrived. Word had traveled. Abigail Turner was there, and Calloway, and at least a dozen other faces Samuel recognized from the fence line and the food baskets. Holt was at the table, sitting at one end, his arms crossed. Patterson was beside him. Barnes was at the head of the table, and he called the meeting to order with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. "Mr. Walker," Barnes said, "you've requested time to speak regarding an application to establish an independent school on your property, to be operated by Mrs. Sarah Brooks." "That's right," Samuel said. "The floor is yours." Samuel stood. He looked at the board members. He looked at Holt. He looked at Patterson. Then he looked at the benches where his family sat. Sarah with Rose on her lap, Lily straight-backed and serious, Jacob trying not to fidget, Ethan watching with those old eyes that had seen too much. 20 years ago, Samuel said, I let one person's lies convince me that I was not worthy of being part of a family. I spent 19 years alone on my ranch, believing that. And then 4 children and their mother showed up in my barn, hungry and scared and brave beyond anything I had ever seen. They didn't ask me for anything. They didn't owe me anything. But they taught me something I had forgotten. He paused. They taught me that family is not about blood. It's about choice. It's about showing up every day and choosing to be there for each other. He looked at Holt. I know there are people in this room who think that Sarah Brooks and her children are a problem to be managed, a situation to be resolved. But they are not a problem. They are people. A mother who has done everything in her power to keep her children safe. A boy who stood between me and his sisters with nothing but his own 2 arms. A girl who organized a library before she could reach the top shelf. Another boy who built desks for a classroom that didn't even exist yet. And a 4-year-old who calls me cowboy and makes me believe that I deserve to be called something good. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that made the room quiet in a way that went beyond mere attention. I'm not asking you to give Sarah Brooks anything. I'm asking you to let her build something with her own hands. She has earned that right. And if you vote against her, you will be telling every person in this county that a woman who has lost everything and fought her way back does not deserve a second chance. And I don't believe that is who this county is. He sat down. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Barnes cleared his throat. The board will now discuss the matter. Holt leaned forward. That was a fine speech, Walker. But the issue here is not about second chances. It's about standards. Mrs. Brooks has no permanent residence, no established means of support, and no— She has a permanent residence, Samuel said. My residence. She has a legal arrangement with this ranch. She has a documented community service operation. She has 400 books and a curriculum that Mr. Barnes himself has reviewed and approved. And she has support from the people of this county, which I believe includes several of the people on this board. Holt's jaw tightened. That's not— The motion, Barnes interrupted, is to approve the establishment of an independent school on the Walker property, to be operated by Sarah Brooks, subject to quarterly review by the county superintendent. All in favor? Abigail Turner's hand went up immediately, then another board member, then another. Holt did not raise his hand. Patterson did not raise his hand, but it did not matter. "The motion carries," Barnes said. The room erupted in applause. Rose, who had been sitting on her mother's lap with the patience of a small creature who understood that important things were happening, clapped her hands together and announced, "We did it!" to no one in particular. Lily was crying. Jacob was grinning. Ethan was looking at Samuel with an expression that Samuel had never seen on his face before, something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that it changed the shape of his whole face. Sarah was looking at Samuel. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They rode home in the evening light, the wagon full of children who were too excited to sit still, and a mother who kept looking at Samuel like she was trying to memorize the shape of him against the sky. Samuel rode beside them, and he thought about the sign that Ethan would carve later, the one that would hang on the gatepost for generations. He did not know about that yet. He only knew that he had spent 19 years alone, and now he had a family. And that was worth every fire he had ever walked through. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe. The morning after the school board meeting broke clear and cool, the kind of morning that made a man remember why he had chosen to live on this land in the first place. Samuel was at the barn before first light, checking on the horses and running through the work that needed doing. But his mind kept drifting back to the night before, the vote, the applause, the look on Sarah's face when she realized they had won. He had not allowed himself to feel the full weight of it yet. That was not his way. He processed things by working through them, by letting his hands do what his mind could not yet organize. He was forking hay into the stalls when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Ethan stood in the barn doorway, still in his shirt sleeves, his feet bare in the dust. The boy looked younger in the early light, softer somehow, the hard edges of survival worn down by weeks of regular meals and sleep. "You're up early," Samuel said. "Couldn't sleep," Ethan said. "Too much thinking." Samuel set down the pitchfork. "What about?" Ethan came into the barn and leaned against a stall post. He looked at the floor for a moment, then up at Samuel. "About what you said last night, at the meeting, about family being a choice." Samuel waited. "I've been thinking about that a lot," Ethan said. "About what it means, about whether I'm allowed to choose." "You are," Samuel said. "Every day." Ethan nodded slowly. "I've been the one making the choices for a long time. What we ate, where we slept, when we moved. It was my job, my responsibility." He paused. "I don't know how to stop." Samuel crossed the barn and sat down on a bale of hay, bringing himself to the boy's level. "You don't have to stop overnight. You just have to start letting other people help carry the weight. That's not weakness. That's trust." Ethan looked at him. "I trust you," he said. The words came out simple and plain, without drama, the way true things often do when they have been sitting in a person's chest for a long time and finally find their way out. Samuel felt something shift in his own chest. "I trust you too, son." The word came out before he planned it. He had not called anyone son in 19 years. It hung in the air between them, and Ethan's eyes went bright, but he did not look away. "Okay," Ethan said. "Okay." They sat in the barn for a while longer, not talking, just existing in the same space, the way men do when they have said what needed to be said and do not need to fill the silence with noise. The school opened 3 days later. Sarah had prepared the room in the old storage shed with the care of someone who believed that a place of learning should feel like a place of possibility. The desks that Jacob had built were arranged in 2 neat rows. The books were organized on shelves that Lily had labeled by subject and reading level. Rose's drawings hung on the walls, mostly pictures of the cat, the horse, and a tall figure with a hat that was clearly Samuel. A blackboard that Samuel had borrowed from the church and carried back on the wagon stood at the front of the room. The first students were the Brooks children themselves, but word had spread, and by the end of the first week, 4 other children from neighboring farms had joined them. The Turner grandchildren, whose mother had heard about Sarah's reputation and decided that a mile walk each way was worth a proper education. By the end of the second week, there were 8. By the end of the first month, there were 12. Samuel stayed out of the way during school hours, working the fence lines and the cattle with Doss, but he found reasons to pass by the shed when he could. He would catch glimpses of Sarah at the blackboard, her hands moving as she explained something, her voice carrying through the open window. He would see the children's heads bent over their work, the quiet concentration of young minds being shaped. And he would see Ethan sitting at the back of the room, not with the resentment he had expected, but with the focused attention of someone who was finally allowing himself to learn. It was not that the resistance had disappeared entirely. There were still moments when Ethan would bristle at being treated like a child, when the old guard would rise up in him and he would argue or withdraw. But those moments came less frequently now, and when they did, Sarah handled them with the patience of someone who understood exactly what her son was going through, because she was going through something similar herself. The school gave Sarah something she had not had in years, a purpose that was entirely her own. She threw herself into the teaching with a passion that Samuel had only glimpsed before in brief moments. The way she organized the books, the way she planned lessons, the way she worked with each child according to their needs. She came in from the schoolhouse every evening tired but satisfied, and she would sit at the kitchen table with Samuel after supper, going over the next day's plans while the children played outside or did their chores. One evening, about 6 weeks after the school opened, she looked up from her notes and said, "I think I'm happy." Samuel set down his coffee. "That's good." "I mean it," she said. "I think I'm actually happy. For the first time since Thomas died, I wake up in the morning and I'm not afraid." He did not know what to say to that, so he said the truth. "I'm glad." She smiled at him, a real smile, not the careful, measured one she had worn in the early days. "You did that," she said. "You gave us a place to be. You gave me a reason to hope again." "You did that yourself," Samuel said. "I just opened a door." She reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture had become familiar now, natural, something that happened without thinking. "We did it together," she said. "That's what matters." The trouble came on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. Samuel was mending a section of fence near the road when he saw a horse approaching at a fast trot. The rider was a boy from town, the same one who had delivered the school board letter months earlier. He pulled up at the fence line and held out an envelope without dismounting. "Mr. Walker," the boy said, "Mr. Barnes asked me to bring this to you directly. He said it was urgent." Samuel took the envelope. He opened it, standing there by the fence, the horse breathing hard beside him, the winter wind cutting through his coat. The letter was brief. It was from Barnes, and it said that a formal complaint had been filed with the State Education Board in Austin, alleging that the school on the Walker property was operating without proper certification, and that the teacher, Sarah Brooks, had been accused of moral unfitness. The complaint had been signed by 3 members of the community, and the state had ordered a formal investigation. An inspector would be arriving within the month. Samuel read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He thanked the boy and sent him on his way. He stood at the fence for a long time, looking out at the land, feeling the cold wind on his face. He knew who had filed the complaint. He did not need to see the names. He walked back to the house. Sarah was in the schoolroom with the children, and he did not interrupt her. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him and waited for the afternoon to pass. When the children were finished and sent outside to play, Sarah came into the house and found him sitting there. She saw the letter on the table. She saw his face. She did not ask what it said. She simply sat down across from him and waited. He told her. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who signed it?" "Barnes didn't say, but we know." "Holt," she said, "and Patterson, and probably Croft." "Probably." She looked at the letter. Her hands were folded on the table, still, but he could see the tension in her knuckles. "They're not going to stop," she said. "They're going to keep coming until they find something that sticks." "Then we'll keep fighting," Samuel said. "For how long?" "As long as it takes." She looked at him. "Samuel, I have been fighting for 2 years. Since Thomas died, I have been fighting every single day just to keep my children alive. And I am tired. I am so tired." He reached across the table and took her hands. "I know," he said. "I know you're tired. But you're not fighting alone anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together." She held his hands tightly. "The inspector could shut us down," she said. "They could take the children. They could." "They won't," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears on her face, but her voice was steady. "I need to tell the children." "Not tonight," Samuel said. "Let them have tonight. Tomorrow we'll tell them together." She nodded. They sat there at the kitchen table, holding hands in the silence, while outside they could hear Rose laughing at something Jacob had done, and Lily's voice raised in mock complaint, and the sound of a family that had built itself out of nothing and was not going to let anyone tear it apart. The inspector arrived 3 weeks later, on a cold December morning with frost on the ground and a pale sun struggling to break through the clouds. His name was Graves, and he was a thin man with spectacles and a leather folder full of papers. He did not smile when he got off his horse, and he did not seem impressed by anything he saw. Samuel met him at the gate. Sarah stood on the porch, the children gathered behind her. The younger ones had been told to be on their best behavior, and they were trying, though Rose was already fidgeting. "Mr. Walker," Graves said, extending a hand that felt like cold bone. "I've been sent by the state board to investigate a complaint regarding the educational institution operating on your property." "You'll find everything in order," Samuel said. "That remains to be seen." Graves spent the morning going through Sarah's records, her teaching certificates from 7 years earlier, her curriculum plans, her student attendance records, the books she was using, the physical condition of the schoolroom. He asked questions in a flat, neutral tone and wrote down the answers in a small notebook. He interviewed Sarah alone for an hour while Samuel waited outside with the children, pacing the yard. When the interview was over, Graves emerged and said he would like to speak with the children, separately. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Ethan first." Ethan went into the schoolroom with his shoulders back and his face carefully blank. He was in there for 20 minutes. When he came out, his expression gave nothing away. Jacob went next, then Lily. Rose was last. She walked into the schoolroom with the confidence of someone who had never met a stranger and emerged 10 minutes later holding a piece of candy that Graves had given her, which she immediately bit into with the satisfaction of someone who had won something. Graves came out last. He stood in the yard, looked at the schoolroom, looked at Sarah, looked at Samuel. He tucked his notebook into his leather folder. "I'll be submitting my report to Austin within the week," he said. "Will the school stay open?" Sarah asked. Graves looked at her for a long moment. "That's not my decision to make," he said. "I report what I find. The board decides." He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. That night, after the children were in bed, Samuel and Sarah sat on the porch in the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. The air was still and sharp, the kind of cold that made a man grateful for every layer he wore. "What do you think he saw?" Sarah asked. "I think he saw what we wanted him to see," Samuel said. "A good teacher, a clean room, children who are learning." "But you don't know for sure." "No, I don't." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "If they shut us down, I don't know what I'll do. Then we'll find another way." "It's not that simple." "It never is," Samuel said, "but nothing worth doing ever is." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat there in the cold, together, waiting for whatever came next. The letter from Austin arrived on the morning of Christmas Eve. It came by regular mail, a plain envelope with the state board's return address. Samuel saw it in Calloway's hand when the man rode out to deliver the week's supplies, and he knew what it was before he opened it. He stood in the yard and read it while Sarah watched from the porch. The school had been approved. Full certification, retroactive to the date of its founding. The complaint had been dismissed as unfounded. The inspector had noted in his report that the quality of instruction was exemplary and that the teacher's character was above reproach. Samuel lowered the letter. He looked at Sarah. He did not say anything. He just walked to the porch and handed her the letter. She read it. She read it again. And then she did something Samuel had never seen her do before. She laughed. A full, real, unguarded laugh that carried across the yard and brought the children running from wherever they had been hiding. "What happened?" Lily demanded. "Did we win?" Jacob asked. Rose, who did not need context to celebrate, threw her arms in the air and shouted, "Hooray!" Ethan stood at the edge of the porch, looking at Samuel. Samuel met his eyes and nodded. The boy's face broke into a smile. A real smile, the first one Samuel had ever seen from him that did not have an edge of caution or reserve. They spent Christmas Eve in the house with a fire in the stove and a small tree that Jacob and Samuel had cut from the edge of the property. Lily had decorated it with strings of dried berries and paper stars she had made herself. Rose had placed Biscuit under the tree at least 4 times, and the cat had resigned himself to his fate. Ethan had carved a small wooden horse for Rose, using skills Samuel had not known he had, and presented it to her with the gruff tenderness of a boy who was learning how to be soft. Sarah had made a dinner from the provisions the town had sent, a proper Christmas meal, with a chicken that had been fattened for the occasion, and a pie made from the last of the dried apples. They ate at the table that had once held only 1 plate and 1 cup, and the sound of laughter filled every corner of the house. That night, after the children were asleep, Samuel and Sarah sat in front of the fire. The tree stood in the corner, the dying embers casting long shadows across the room. They did not speak. They did not need to. The quiet between them was full, not empty. The kind of quiet that comes when 2 people have stopped being afraid of what the silence might hold. Samuel looked at the tree, at the stars on the window, at the woman beside him. He thought about the boy with his arms spread wide, and the drawing in his pocket, and the fire, and the school board, and the long road they had traveled to get here. He thought about how strange it was that the thing he had been most afraid of, letting people in, had turned out to be the thing that saved him. But the peace did not last. 3 days after Christmas, a rider appeared on the road. Not the mail boy, not one of the neighbors. A stranger, well-dressed, riding a fine bay horse. He stopped at the gate and looked at the house with the assessing eye of someone who was measuring what he saw against what he had been told. Samuel walked out to meet him. The man dismounted and extended his hand. "Mr. Walker," he said, "my name is Daniel Brooks. I'm Thomas's brother. I believe I'm expected." Daniel Brooks stood at the gate with his fine bay horse and his city clothes and the expression of a man who had spent the long ride rehearsing what he was going to say, and had not yet decided if he had gotten it right. He was taller than Samuel had expected, with the same dark hair and serious eyes that Ethan had, but softened by a life that had not required him to live in a shed or divide rotten peaches among 4 hungry children. He held his hat in his hands, and he looked at Samuel with the particular discomfort of someone who knew he had done something wrong, and had traveled a long distance to make it right, without being entirely certain that making it right was still possible. Samuel did not step aside to let him through the gate. He stood where he was and waited. "Mr. Walker," Daniel said, "I know I'm not welcome here. I know I've got no right to ask for anything, but I'd be obliged if you'd let me speak to Sarah. Just for a few minutes." Samuel looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the bare branches of the mesquite tree. Behind him, he could hear the distant sound of children's voices from the schoolroom. Sarah's class was in session, and he could pick out Lily's clear tones answering a question, and Rose's higher voice demanding attention, and Sarah's calm patience bringing order to the chaos. "She's teaching right now," Samuel said. "You can wait on the porch until she's done." Daniel nodded. He tied his horse to the gatepost and followed Samuel to the house, walking with the careful steps of someone who was not sure what the ground beneath him might do. Samuel sat him on the porch with a cup of coffee and went back to his work without offering further conversation. He had learned over the months that the best way to handle uncertainty was to keep his hands busy and let things unfold at their own pace. The school session ended at noon. Samuel heard the children spill out of the shed, their voices carrying across the yard, and then he heard Sarah's footsteps as she walked toward the house to see who had come. He was at the barn, pretending to check a harness that did not need checking, but he watched from the shadows as she reached the porch and saw Daniel standing there. She stopped. She did not speak. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at a door they had closed and locked and thought they would never open again. "Sarah," Daniel said. He stepped forward, then stopped, as if he was not sure how close he was allowed to get. "I know I should have written. I should have come sooner. I should have done a lot of things differently." "Yes," Sarah said. Her voice was flat. "You should have. I'm here now. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down on the porch step, not in the chair he had been using, but on the step itself, her arms wrapped around her knees. She did not invite him to sit beside her, but he sat down anyway, on the other end of the step, leaving a careful distance between them. Samuel stayed at the barn. He told himself he was giving them privacy. He told himself it was none of his business. But he did not stop watching. "Margaret talked to me," Daniel said. "My wife. She talked to me for 3 days after your letter arrived. She told me I was a coward and a fool, and that if I didn't go find you and make things right, she would leave me and take the children." He paused. "She was right. I was a coward. I was scared of what it would mean to take on more responsibility when we already had our hands full. And I told myself it was practical. I told myself I was being sensible. But it wasn't sensible. It was selfish." Sarah said nothing. "I heard about what happened here," Daniel continued. "The fire, the school. The man who ran into the flames to save Thomas's photograph." He shook his head. "When I heard that, I couldn't sit still anymore. I had to come see for myself. I had to see if you were all right, if the children were all right." "We are all right," Sarah said. "We are more than all right. We have a home. We have a school. We have people who care about us." "I can see that." "Then why are you here?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up, carrying the cold across the yard. "Because I want to make it right," he said. "I want you to know that if you ever need anything, money, a place to stay, help with the children, I will be there. I will not turn you away again." Sarah looked at him. Her face was unreadable. "That's a generous offer," she said. "But we don't need it. We have everything we need right here." "I can see that," Daniel said again. "But I also see that you're living in a house that isn't yours, running a school that could be shut down at any time, depending on the union of men in this county. I see that you have no legal claim to this land, no protection if something were to happen to Mr. Walker." He paused. "I have a house in San Antonio. It's not large, but it has room for all of you. I have a business that could provide work. The children could go to a proper school with proper resources. You would be safe." Sarah stood up. She brushed the dust from her skirt. "Daniel, I appreciate that you came all this way. I appreciate that you're trying to make amends. But I am not going to uproot my children again. We have found a home here. We have found a family. And I am not going to leave that because you've decided that your guilt is worth more than our stability." Daniel stood up too. He looked at her with something that was not quite defeat, but close to it. "I'm not asking you to decide today," he said. "I'm staying at the boarding house in town for a few days. I'd like to meet the children. I'd like to see the school. And then, if you still want me to go, I'll go." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "You can meet the children tonight at supper," she said. "But I make no promises beyond that." She turned and walked into the house. That evening, the kitchen felt smaller than it ever had before. The table that had held 7 people comfortably now seemed crowded, not because there was not enough space, but because of the weight of the unknown sitting in the chair where Daniel Brooks had been placed. Samuel had insisted that Daniel stay for the meal, not out of hospitality, but because he wanted to see the man's face when he looked at his brother's children. Ethan had taken the chair directly across from Daniel, and he was watching him the same way he had watched Samuel on that first night behind the barn, measuring, calculating, deciding. Jacob was beside his brother, trying to be brave but stealing glances at his uncle when he thought no one was looking. Lily had positioned herself next to her mother, close enough to hold her hand under the table. Rose, oblivious to the tension, had climbed into Samuel's lap before anyone could stop her, and was using his chest as a backrest while she ate her bread. Daniel looked at them all. His eyes lingered on Ethan the longest. "You look like your father," he said. Ethan did not respond. "He had the same eyes," Daniel continued, "the same way of looking at a person like he was figuring them out." "Did you know him well?" Lily asked. Her voice was polite, careful, the voice of a child who had been taught to make conversation even when she did not want to. "I knew him when we were boys," Daniel said. "We were close then. We drifted apart after he married your mother, not because of anything bad, just life. He went his way, I went mine. I always thought we'd have time to find our way back to each other." He looked down at his plate. I was wrong. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of forks on plates. "Where do you live?" Jacob asked. "San Antonio," Daniel said. "Is it big?" "Big enough." "Do you have cows?" "I have a store. I sell dry goods and hardware. No cows." Jacob considered this. "That's too bad. Cows are better." Rose, who had been studying Daniel with the focused attention of a 4-year-old who had not yet decided if she approved of a new person, pointed her bread at him and said, "Are you staying?" Daniel looked at her. "For a few days." "Good," Rose said, and went back to her bread as if the matter was settled. Sarah had not said much during the meal. She had eaten mechanically, her attention divided between the children and Daniel and Samuel, who she kept glancing at with an expression that Samuel could not quite read. He did not blame her. He did not know what he was feeling either. After supper, the children were sent to do their evening chores, and the adults were left at the table with the remains of the meal and the lamp flickering between them. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Brooks," Samuel said. He had not planned to speak, but the words came anyway. "I don't know why you're here. I don't know what you want. But I know that these children have been through more in the last 2 years than most adults go through in a lifetime. And I'm not going to let anyone add to that." Daniel met his gaze. "I'm not here to take them away," he said. "I'm here to offer them a choice, a different option, if they want it." "They have a choice," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "They have a home." "I know." Daniel looked at his hands. "I'm not trying to take that away from them. I'm just trying to be the brother I should have been from the beginning." The next morning, Daniel walked to the schoolroom and asked if he could observe. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. He sat at the back of the room on a stool that Jacob had built, and he watched as Sarah taught the morning lesson. He watched her move among the children, bending down to correct a letter formation, praising a correct answer, gently redirecting a wandering attention. He watched the quiet competence of someone who had found her calling and was fulfilling it with every ounce of her being. When the class broke for lunch, Daniel walked out to where Samuel was splitting wood near the barn. He stood at a respectful distance and watched Samuel work for a few minutes before speaking. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" Samuel drove the axe into the splitting block and turned. "Yes, she is. I didn't know. When Thomas wrote to me about her, he said she was a good teacher and a good mother. But I didn't understand what that meant until I saw it." Samuel waited. "I'm not going to try to take her away from here," Daniel said. "I see what you've built. I see what she's built. And I can see what you mean to each other, even if neither of you has said it out loud." He paused. "But I want to help. Not because I owe it, but because I want to be part of their lives. I want to be their uncle. I want my children to know their cousins." Samuel picked up the next piece of wood and set it on the block. "That's up to Sarah," he said, "and the children." "I know." "For what it's worth," Samuel said, "I think it's a good thing that you came." Daniel nodded. He turned and walked back toward the house, and Samuel watched him go, feeling something shift in his chest that he could not quite name. The week that followed was strange and full of small adjustments. Daniel stayed at the boarding house in town, but came out to the ranch every day. He brought presents for the children, books for Lily, a pocket knife for Ethan that Sarah inspected carefully before allowing him to keep it, a set of toy soldiers for Jacob, and a doll for Rose that she immediately named Clara and refused to put down. He helped with the chores, awkwardly at first, but with the willingness of a man who was not used to physical labor but was determined to prove he could do it anyway. Ethan remained the most guarded. He accepted the knife with a polite thank you, but Samuel noticed that he did not carry it the way he carried the things he truly valued. He kept it in his room, on the shelf, like something that was being held at arm's length for inspection. One evening, Samuel found Ethan sitting on the fence near the east pasture, looking out at the darkening sky. He climbed up and sat beside him without a word. "He seems nice," Ethan said eventually. "He seems like he's trying," Samuel agreed. "Do you trust him?" Samuel thought about it. "I trust that he's trying. I trust that he feels bad about what happened and wants to make it right. But trust is earned over time, not given all at once." Ethan nodded slowly. "Mama says he's family, blood family. She says that means something." "It does mean something," Samuel said, "but it's not the only thing that matters." Ethan looked at him. "What is?" Samuel considered the question. Being there when it counts, he said. Showing up, staying when it's hard. That's what matters. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You stayed." "I did." "You stayed through the fire and the school board and the inspector and everything else." "I did." The boy looked out at the horizon. "That means more to me than blood," he said quietly. Samuel put his hand on the boy's shoulder. They sat on the fence together in the fading light, and neither of them said anything more. On the 5th day, Daniel announced that he needed to return to San Antonio. His wife was expecting him, and his business could not be left unattended much longer. He came to the ranch on his last morning and stood in the yard with his horse, saying goodbye. Sarah stood with the children around her. Lily was crying quietly. Jacob was trying not to. Rose was holding Clara the doll with one hand and clutching her mother's skirt with the other. Ethan stood apart, his face carefully composed. Daniel knelt down in front of Ethan. "I know I'm not your father," he said. "I know I can't replace what you lost. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Your father would be proud of you. The way you've taken care of your mother and your sisters and your brother, that takes a kind of courage that most men never find." Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not speak. "If you ever need anything," Daniel said, "anything at all, you write to me. I'll come. I promise." Ethan nodded once. It was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Daniel stood up and turned to Sarah. "I meant what I said," he told her. "If you ever need a place to go, a place to fall back on, my door is open. No conditions, no expectations." "Thank you," Sarah said. It was not warm, but it was not cold either. Daniel looked at Samuel last. He walked over to him and extended his hand. "Take care of them." "I intend to," Samuel said. They shook hands. Daniel mounted his horse and rode out through the gate. At the road, he turned back once, raised his hand in a wave, and then he was gone. The yard felt emptier after he left. The children drifted back to their activities, Lily to her books, Jacob to the barn, Rose to find Biscuit. Ethan stood by the gate for a long time, watching the road where Daniel had disappeared. Sarah walked over to Samuel. "That was hard," she said. "Which part?" "The part where I realized I didn't want him to stay, but I also didn't want him to go." She looked at the road. "He's still family. He's Thomas's brother, and I don't want to cut him out. But I also don't want to go back." "You're not going back," Samuel said. "You're here. This is your home." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because you chose it. Every day you choose it, and so do I." She took his hand. They stood in the yard together, watching the empty road, and the winter wind carried the dust across the ground. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Sarah came to Samuel's room. She stood in the doorway, and he could see in the lamplight that she had been crying. "I need to tell you something," she said. He sat up. "What is it?" She came in and sat on the edge of the bed. "Daniel asked me to marry him." The words hung in the air. Samuel felt them land in his chest like stones. "He said," she continued, her voice careful, measured, "that he would take care of us, that his wife would welcome us, that the children could grow up in a proper home with proper schooling and never have to worry about where their next meal was coming from." Samuel said nothing. He was not sure he could speak. "I told him no," she said. The air came back into the room. "I told him no because this is my home. These people are my family, and the man I love is sitting right here in front of me, and I have been too afraid to say it out loud until now." Samuel looked at her. The lamplight caught the side of her face, the same way it had on the porch so many weeks ago, and he realized that he had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. He had been waiting for her to say the words that he had been too afraid to say himself. "I love you," she said. "I love you, Samuel Walker, and I am not going anywhere." He reached out and took her hands. They were cold, but they were steady. "I love you too," he said. "I have loved you since the moment you stepped out of that shed with your chin up and your pride intact. I just didn't know how to say it." She laughed, a wet, broken laugh that was half tears and half relief. "Then we're both fools." "Good fools," he said. He pulled her into his arms and held her. The house was quiet around them. The children were sleeping in the rooms that had been empty for 19 years. Outside, the wind blew across the open land, carrying the promise of winter and the first faint hint of spring somewhere far away. They had not said yes to each other yet, but they would. They had time now. Time was the one thing they had not had before, and now it stretched out before them like the open range, full of possibility and danger, and the chance to build something that would last. But as Samuel held her in the quiet of the room, something else stirred in him, not doubt, but a deep, protective wariness. Daniel had come once, and he had left an offer on the table. He had asked Sarah to marry him. He had been refused. But the question of what would happen if Sarah ever changed her mind, if the weight of the fight ever became too heavy, that question had not been answered. And Samuel knew, with the certainty of a man who had faced fire and flood and the cruelty of men, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to answer it. The weeks after Daniel's visit settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, like a life that might last. Samuel woke each morning to the sound of Sarah moving in the kitchen, to the thump of children's feet on the floorboards, to the low murmur of voices that meant the house was full of living things. He had spent 19 years waking to silence, and he still had not grown used to the noise. He hoped he never would. The love that had been spoken between them did not change everything at once. It changed things slowly, the way water changes stone over years, not days. Sarah began leaving her things in his room without comment. A brush on the dresser, a shawl draped over the chair, a book she was reading on the bedside table. He began thinking of the house as theirs instead of his. The children noticed, though they did not say anything directly. Lily gave them knowing looks. Jacob seemed puzzled but accepting. Rose simply climbed into Samuel's lap more often, as if confirming that he was now officially part of the furniture. Ethan said nothing, but Samuel caught him watching with the careful attention of someone who was processing a change and deciding how to feel about it. The school continued to grow. By mid-January, Sarah had 15 students, including children from farms as far as 5 miles away. The parents had formed a rotation for transporting the younger ones, and the schoolroom had become a hub of the community in a way that none of them had anticipated. Abigail Turner came out twice a week to help with the older children's reading. Calloway's wife donated a set of maps that had been gathering dust in the store's back room. Even some of the families who had been neutral during the school board fight began sending their children, having seen that the school was not a threat but an asset. Samuel spent his days on the ranch, working the cattle and repairing the fences that the fire had damaged. Doss had taken on more responsibility, and the two of them worked in comfortable silence, the way men do when they have learned to trust each other without needing words. But Samuel's mind was never far from the house, from the schoolroom, from the woman who had become the center of his life, without his quite realizing it was happening. One evening in late January, after the children were in bed, Sarah found him on the porch. The night was cold but clear, the stars sharp and close, and she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and sat in the chair beside him. "Something's been on my mind," she said. "Tell me." "Daniel's offer," she paused. "Not the marriage part, the other part. The offer of a backup, a place to go." Samuel said nothing. He had been thinking about it too. "I told him no," she continued. "I meant it. But sometimes I wonder if I'm being foolish. If I'm putting too much faith in something that could fall apart." "What could fall apart?" "Everything. The school, the ranch, us." She looked at him. "You. Something could happen to you, and then where would we be?" "I'm not planning on going anywhere. People don't plan on dying. It happens anyway." He reached over and took her hand. "You're right, it does. But I can't live my life preparing for the worst. I've done that. I spent 19 years preparing for the worst, and I missed out on everything that mattered." She squeezed his hand. "I know. I'm the same way. I've been planning for disaster since the day Thomas died, and I don't know how to stop." "You don't have to stop," he said. "Just let yourself enjoy the good parts in between." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "The good parts are very good," she said quietly. "Then let's focus on those." They sat in the cold, watching the stars, and Samuel let himself believe that this could last. It was a dangerous thing to believe, but he did it anyway. February brought rain. Not the gentle, soaking rain that the land needed, but hard, driving storms that turned the dirt to mud and kept the children inside for days at a time. The schoolroom roof, which Samuel had patched after the fire, began to leak in 3 places. He spent a morning on the roof in the cold rain, hammering new shingles into place, while Sarah held the ladder and passed him supplies. When he came down, soaked through and shivering, she wrapped a dry blanket around him and made him sit by the stove with a cup of coffee. "You're going to catch your death," she said. "I've caught worse," he said, but he did not argue about the stove. The rain brought another problem. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, which had been dry since the fire, began to swell. Samuel watched it with the practiced eye of a man who had seen too many springs turn into floods. He moved the cattle to higher ground and reinforced the crossing that led to the school road. He did not mention his worries to Sarah. There was no point in worrying her about something that might not happen. But it did happen. The creek rose on a Tuesday night while they were sleeping. Samuel woke to the sound of water moving faster than it should, a low rushing that had not been there when he went to bed. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before his mind had fully caught up with his body. He grabbed a lantern and ran to the window. The creek was already over its banks, spreading across the low pasture in a sheet of dark water that reflected the lantern light in broken fragments. He woke Sarah. "Get the children dressed, warm clothes, everything we can carry." She did not ask questions. She moved through the house with the same calm efficiency she had shown the night of the fire, waking the children, gathering blankets and food, keeping her voice steady even as the younger ones began to cry. By the time the first light of dawn broke gray and watery through the clouds, the water was lapping at the edge of the barn. The schoolroom was already surrounded, isolated on a small rise that was rapidly becoming an island. The house sat on slightly higher ground, but not high enough. Samuel calculated the distance to the hills, the time it would take to move the family, the things they could carry, and the things they would have to leave behind. He made the decision quickly. "We're going to the hill," he said. "The one past the east fence. It's high enough. We'll wait it out there." Sarah nodded. She had the children bundled in every layer they owned, and she had somehow managed to pack a bag with the essentials: food, dry clothes, the photograph in its tin box, and the ledger from the school that she refused to leave behind. Ethan was carrying Rose, who had wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. Lily was holding Jacob's hand. They looked like refugees, Samuel thought, and the thought made him angry in a way he had not expected. They had already lost everything once. They should not have to lose it again. They made it to the hill as the water rose around the house. Samuel watched from the high ground as the flood took the schoolroom first, rising over the floor that Jacob had built, covering the desks, the books, the drawings that Rose had hung on the walls. The water reached the porch of the house, then the first step, then the second. It stopped rising when it was 3 steps from the door, held back by some small mercy of the land's slope. They spent the night on the hill, huddled under blankets that Sarah had packed, eating the bread she had brought and drinking water from a canteen. The children were too exhausted to be afraid. They slept in a pile, wrapped in each other, while Samuel and Sarah sat watch, taking turns sleeping and keeping the lantern lit. By morning, the water had begun to recede. The creek was still high, but it had stopped rising, and the sky showed patches of blue between the clouds. Samuel surveyed the damage from the hill. The schoolroom was half collapsed, the walls bowed outward from the pressure of the water. The barn had lost part of its roof. The house looked intact, but there would be mud and water damage inside. The fences were gone, washed away or buried under debris. He did not let himself feel the weight of it. Not yet. There was work to do, and the work would carry him through the despair the same way it always had. The recovery took weeks. The community rallied the same way it had after the fire, but the flood had been more widespread, and many families had their own losses to deal with. The Turners had lost a barn. Calloway's store had been flooded. 3 families had lost their homes entirely. The county was overwhelmed, and help from the state was slow in coming. Samuel rebuilt the schoolroom himself, with Ethan and Jacob working beside him. They salvaged what they could. The books had been stored on high shelves, and most had survived, though their pages were warped and stained. The desks were ruined, but the wood could be repurposed. The blackboard had fallen and cracked in two, but Samuel bought a new one from town with money he had set aside for something else. Sarah took the children into the house for lessons, using the kitchen table as a desk and the wall as a blackboard. She did not complain. She did not ask for help. She simply adapted, the way she had been adapting since the day her husband died. But Samuel noticed that she was tired. Not the tired of a long day's work, but the deeper tired of someone who had been holding things together for too long. He noticed the shadows under her eyes, the way she sometimes stared at nothing, the way her hands were still for too long when she thought no one was looking. One evening, after the children were asleep, he sat down across from her at the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. "Talk to me," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "I'm tired, Samuel. I am so tired of fighting." "I know. Every time I think we've made it through, something else happens. The fire, the school board, the flood. And I keep thinking, what's next? What's the next thing that's going to try to take everything away from us?" "I don't know," he said, "but I know we'll face it together." She shook her head. "That's not enough anymore. I need something more than just surviving. I need to know that this is real, that we are real, that we are not going to be swept away by the next disaster." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the drawer where he kept his important papers. He pulled out a small leather pouch that had belonged to his father, and from it he took a ring. It was simple, a thin gold band that had been his mother's, worn smooth by decades of wear. He walked back to the table and knelt down in front of her. "Sarah Brooks," he said, his voice rough and low, "I have spent 19 years alone, and I have spent the last 8 months learning what it means to not be alone. I have watched you fight for your children, build a school, face down men who wanted to destroy you, and carry on when anyone else would have broken. I have watched you love your children and love me, even when you were afraid. And I know that I am not a young man. I know that I do not have much to offer beyond this land and these hands. But I am offering them to you, all of it, forever." He held up the ring. "Marry me, Sarah. Let's make this real. Let's make it permanent. Let's give these children a family that nobody can take away." Sarah stared at him. Her hands were pressed over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was not making a sound. "Yes," she said. The word came out in a breath, barely audible. Then stronger, louder, breaking through the silence of the kitchen. "Yes, Samuel, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. It had always been meant to fit. She pulled him up and kissed him, there in the kitchen with the dishes still in the sink, and the lamp burning low, and outside the wind blew across the recovering land, and the house that had been empty for 19 years was full of something that could never be taken away. The wedding was small, held on a Sunday in early March, when the ground was still soft from the flood, and the first green shoots were pushing up through the mud. The church in Harlan was half full, not because people did not care, but because the flood had scattered families, and the roads were still bad. But those who came brought what they could: fresh bread, a jar of preserves, a quilt pieced together by the Turner sisters, a set of mismatched chairs that the Callaways had salvaged from their damaged store. Rose was the flower girl again, and she had taken her duties seriously enough that she had practiced dropping petals for 3 days straight, leaving a trail of dried flowers through the house that Sarah was still finding in unexpected places. Lily played the piano, a piece she had learned from the mother of one of her students, working on it quietly for weeks without telling anyone why. Jacob stood beside Ethan, wearing a shirt that had been pressed and repressed until it was as smooth as it would ever get. Ethan stood beside Samuel, not as a groomsman, not as a placeholder, but as a son. He had positioned himself there without being asked, and when Samuel looked at him, the boy met his eyes and nodded once, the same nod he had given in the barn months ago, the one that meant he was present and committed and not going anywhere. Samuel did not cry during the ceremony. He held Sarah's hands and said the words that the preacher recited, and he meant every one of them. But when the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," and Sarah looked at him with those eyes that had seen so much and had not stopped hoping, something in his chest cracked open, and he had to blink hard to keep the tears from falling. Rose, standing at their feet, threw the remaining flower petals into the air with both hands and shouted, "They did it!" Everyone laughed. The sound filled the small church, warm and real and full of life. They had supper in the church hall, a modest meal that tasted like a feast. The children ran between the tables, playing games that involved a great deal of shouting and very few rules. The adults sat in clusters, talking about the flood and the recovery and the spring planting that was coming. And at the center of it all was Samuel and Sarah, their hands touching across the table, their eyes meeting in glances that spoke more than words ever could. That night they came home to the ranch. The house was quiet, the children asleep in their rooms, exhausted from the day's excitement. Samuel and Sarah sat on the porch in the dark, wrapped in the same blanket, looking out at the land that was theirs together now. "Mrs. Walker," he said, testing the words. "Mr. Walker," she said back. He smiled. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." They sat in silence for a while. The stars were out, bright and close, the way they only were on clear nights in the country. The creek was running low and gentle again. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. "Samuel," she said. "I'm not afraid anymore." He turned to look at her. The moonlight caught her face, and she was smiling. Not the measured, careful smile she had worn in the early days, but the full, open smile of a woman who had found what she had been looking for. "Good," he said. "Neither am I." The next morning, Samuel woke to find a piece of paper folded on the kitchen table, held down by a stone that Rose had painted blue. He opened it. It was a drawing, done in crayon, showing a tall figure in a hat and a woman in a dress, with 4 smaller figures arranged around them. Above them, the sun was enormous and yellow, its rays stretching across the top of the page. Below the drawing, in the careful, slightly crooked hand that he now knew better than his own, were 5 words. "Now you are really family." Samuel folded the paper and put it in his chest pocket, beside the drawing that Ethan had given him months ago, beside the list of debts that Sarah had written in precise schoolteacher handwriting, beside the faded photograph that he had run through fire to save. He was wearing 4 pieces of paper against his heart, and they weighed more than any gold ever could. Spring came to Central Texas like a slow exhale, the land releasing the tension of winter and flood and beginning the slow work of renewal. The grass greened along the creek banks. The mesquite tree that had been scorched by fire and soaked by flood put out new leaves, small and tentative at first, then bolder as the days warmed. The cattle that Samuel had moved to high ground during the flood were brought back to the low pastures, and they set to grazing with the single-minded focus of creatures that had no memory of disaster and no fear of the future. Samuel and Sarah had been married for 6 weeks when the first sign of new trouble appeared. It came not in the form of a letter or a rider, but in the silence of the town. Samuel rode into Harlan for supplies on a Tuesday morning, and he noticed that the conversation stopped when he entered the store. Not all of them, not dramatically, but enough. A pause here, a glance there. The kind of quiet that told him something had been said in his absence. Calloway met him at the counter with his usual efficiency, but there was a tightness around the man's eyes that had not been there before. He packed Samuel's order without the small talk that had become customary between them. "Calloway," Samuel said, "what's going on?" Calloway glanced at the other customers, then leaned forward slightly. "There's been talk," he said quietly, "about the school, about the children, about the marriage." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that starts with Holt and spreads like a sickness." Calloway shook his head. "He's been saying that the marriage was a way to keep the children from being placed in proper homes. That Sarah married you to avoid losing them. That you two—" He stopped. "That we two what?" "That you were living together before the wedding. That the children were exposed to immoral behavior." Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's a lie." "I know it is. But Holt's been telling it to anyone who'll listen. And some people are listening." Samuel paid for his supplies and left. He rode home with the cold thing still sitting in his chest, and he tried to decide how to tell Sarah. He decided not to. Not yet. There was no point in worrying her about gossip. Gossip could be weathered. It was the actions that came from gossip that mattered. The action came a week later. A letter arrived from the county clerk's office, informing Sarah that her teaching certification was being reviewed due to a formal complaint regarding moral character. The complaint had been filed by a group of concerned citizens who wished to remain anonymous. The review process would take 30 days, during which the school could continue operating, but a negative finding would result in immediate revocation of her license to teach. Sarah read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Samuel with an expression that was not fear, not anger, but something harder, something that looked like acceptance of a battle she had hoped she would not have to fight. "They're not going to stop," she said. "They're going to keep coming until they find something that sticks. Then we keep fighting. How? I can't prove a negative. I can't prove that I didn't do something that never happened." Samuel thought about this. "You can prove who you are," he said. "You can prove what kind of teacher you are, what kind of mother, what kind of woman. We get statements from the parents whose children you've taught. We get statements from the Turner sisters, from Callaway, from everyone who's seen what you've built here. Do you think that will be enough?" "I don't know, but I know we have to try." Sarah looked down at the ring on her finger, the simple gold band that had been his mother's. "I didn't marry you to protect myself," she said. "I married you because I love you. I know. I need you to know that. Whatever happens with the certification, whatever they say about me, I need you to know that I married you for you." He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands. "I know," he said again, "and I married you for you. Everything else is just noise." She leaned into him. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, while outside the children played in the spring sunshine, unaware that a storm was gathering on the horizon. The statements came in over the following days. Samuel wrote to every family whose children attended the school, and every single one agreed to write a letter attesting to Sarah's character and competence. The Turner sisters wrote a joint letter that was so warm and detailed that Sarah cried when she read it. Callaway wrote one, though he admitted it was not his strength, and asked Lily to help him with the spelling. Even Barnes, the school superintendent, wrote a brief but formal statement affirming that Sarah's teaching was exemplary and that he had never observed any behavior that could be considered inappropriate. Samuel gathered the letters and brought them to the county clerk's office himself. He stood at the counter and watched as the clerk stamped them as received, and he asked to speak with the person handling the complaint. The clerk was a young man with a nervous manner. "That would be Mr. Croft," he said. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Croft is handling this? He's the county administrator. It falls under his purview." Samuel left the office without another word. He stood on the boardwalk outside, looking at the muddy street, the horses tied to the rail, the ordinary bustle of a small town going about its business. Croft had been there from the beginning, standing beside Holt and Patterson, part of the machine that had been trying to destroy Sarah's family since the day they arrived. And now he was the one who would decide whether her teaching career survived. Samuel did not believe in coincidence. He believed in men who knew how to use the system to their advantage. He went to see Hargrove. The lawyer's office was in Austin, a 3-hour ride that Samuel made at dawn the next day. He left Sarah with instructions to keep the children close and not to answer any questions from anyone in an official capacity without him present. She had nodded, her face pale but composed, and she had kissed him before he left in a way that told him she was afraid, but would not say so. Hargrove listened to the situation without interrupting. When Samuel finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and tapped his fingers on the desk. "Croft," he said. "I know the name. He's got a reputation for playing games with paperwork. Nothing illegal, nothing that would get him removed, but enough to make life difficult for people he doesn't like. Can he revoke her certification? He can try. The complaint process requires a hearing, and the hearing board is supposed to be impartial. But if Croft controls who sits on the board, he can stack it in his favor. What can we do?" Hargrove thought for a moment. "We file a request for a state-level review of the process. That puts the decision in the hands of someone outside the county. It takes longer, but it's harder to corrupt." He paused. "It also means the school stays open during the review period. They can't shut it down while the appeal is pending." "It's going to cost," Samuel said. "Everything costs," Hargrove said. "The question is whether it's worth it." "It's worth it," Hargrove nodded. "Then let's get started." Samuel rode back to the ranch with the first steps of a plan forming in his mind. But he also rode with the knowledge that this fight was not going to end quickly. Holt and Croft had chosen their ground carefully. They were not trying to win a single battle. They were trying to wear Sarah down, to make the cost of staying so high that she would eventually leave. He did not intend to let that happen. But he also knew that she was tired, and that even the strongest person could be broken if the pressure never stopped. That evening, Samuel and Sarah sat on the porch after the children were asleep. The spring air was warm and soft, carrying the smell of new grass and damp earth. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in the deepening blue of the sky. "I talked to Hargrove," Samuel said. "He's filing for a state-level review. It means the school stays open while they decide." "How long will that take?" "A few months, maybe more." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "And if they decide against me?" "Then we appeal again. We keep fighting." "What if I don't want to keep fighting?" The words hung in the air. Samuel turned to look at her. Her face was in shadow, but he could see the set of her jaw, the way she was holding herself very still. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm tired of being a battleground. I'm tired of having to prove myself over and over again. I'm tired of waking up every morning wondering what new attack is coming." "I know." "I don't want to leave," she said. "I don't want to give up what we've built. But I also don't know how much more of this I can take." Samuel reached over and took her hand. "Then let me carry some of it." She looked at him. "You already carry so much. I can carry more." She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat in silence, watching the stars appear, and Samuel thought about what it meant to love someone so much that you would fight the same battle 100 times if that was what it took. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of May. It was held in the county courthouse, a modest building of red brick that had stood in the center of Harlan for 40 years. The room was small, with a raised desk for the board and a few rows of benches for spectators. The board consisted of 3 men: Croft, who had appointed himself as chair; a farmer named Henshaw, who had never met Sarah but had a reputation for following Croft's lead; and a woman named Mrs. Ellison, the widow of a former judge, who was known for her sharp mind and her independence. Samuel sat in the front row with Sarah beside him. Ethan had insisted on coming, and he sat on Samuel's other side, his back straight and his face unreadable. The younger children had been left with Abigail Turner, who had promised to bring them fresh cookies and keep them occupied. The hearing began with Croft reading the complaint aloud. It was formal and vague, accusing Sarah of conduct unbecoming a teacher and failure to maintain appropriate moral standards. No specific incidents were cited. No witnesses were named. It was the kind of complaint that was designed to be hard to disprove because it was hard to prove anything specific. Sarah was asked to respond. She stood and read a statement she had prepared, her voice steady and clear. She spoke about her years of teaching, her dedication to her students, the curriculum she had built, and the support of the community. She did not mention Holt or Croft by name, but she made it clear that the complaint was without merit. When she finished, Croft asked if there were any witnesses to be heard. Samuel stood and presented the letters from the parents, from the Turner sisters, from Barnes. Croft took them with the expression of a man accepting something he did not want to read. "We will review these materials," Croft said, "and render a decision within 30 days. "That's not good enough," Mrs. Ellison said. Everyone in the room turned to look at her. "Mrs. Brooks has presented a substantial body of evidence supporting her character and competence," Mrs. Ellison continued. "The complaint against her contains no specific allegations, no witnesses, and no evidence whatsoever. I move that we dismiss this complaint immediately." Henshaw shifted in his seat. Croft's face tightened. The process requires that we act in the interest of justice," Mrs. Ellison said. "And justice is not served by dragging a reputable woman through a months-long investigation based on anonymous accusations." She looked at Croft. "I've known you for 20 years, Mr. Croft. I know what this is about, and I will not be a party to it." The room was silent. Croft looked at Henshaw, who looked at the table and said nothing. "I second the motion," Mrs. Ellison said. "All in favor?" She raised her hand. Henshaw hesitated, then slowly he raised his hand. Croft stared at them. His face was red. "This is—" "The motion carries," Mrs. Ellison said. "The complaint is dismissed. Mrs. Brooks, you are free to continue teaching. This hearing is adjourned." She stood and walked out of the room without looking back. Sarah sat down. Her hands were shaking. Samuel put his arm around her. Beside him, Ethan let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding for a very long time. They walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine, and the first thing Sarah did was laugh. It was a shaky, disbelieving laugh. The laugh of someone who had been braced for a blow that had not fallen. "Who was that woman?" she asked. "Mrs. Ellison," Samuel said. "She's the widow of Judge Ellison. I've never spoken to her in my life." "Then why did she do that?" "Because she's a woman who knows wrong when she sees it," Samuel said. "And she decided to do something about it." Sarah looked at the courthouse, at the window where Croft was probably still standing, watching them leave. "We won," she said, as if she was testing the words. "We won this round," Samuel said. "But Holt and Croft are not going to give up. They'll find another angle." "Then we'll be ready," Sarah said. And for the first time in weeks, her voice carried the old iron, the unbroken strength that had kept her alive through the shed and the fire and the flood. They rode home together, the family whole and intact, and the spring wind carried the promise of better days ahead. But as they passed the gate and saw the house waiting for them, Samuel caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach drop. A piece of paper, nailed to the gatepost, fluttering in the wind. He dismounted and pulled it free. It was a notice, printed on official county stationery, stating that the property known as the Walker Ranch was subject to a tax delinquency claim. The notice claimed that Samuel had failed to pay property taxes for the previous year, and that the county was initiating proceedings to seize the land unless the full amount, plus penalties and interest, was paid within 60 days. Samuel read the notice twice. He had paid his taxes. He had the receipts in the house. He had paid them himself, in person, at the county treasurer's office, the same way he had done every year for 30 years. But the notice was official. It bore the county seal, and it was signed by Croft. Samuel folded the notice and put it in his pocket. He looked at the house, at Sarah on the porch, at the children playing in the yard. He thought about how far they had come, and how much they had to lose. And he realized that the battle was not over. It was just beginning. Samuel stood at the gate with the notice in his hand long enough for the paper to tremble in the wind. He read it a third time, then a fourth, as if repetition might change the words printed on the page. The county seal was real. The signature was real. The amount listed was real. $347 in back taxes, penalties, and interest, due within 60 days, or the property would be subject to seizure and public auction. He had paid his taxes. He had paid them on October 15th of the previous year, the same day he had paid them for the 30 years before that. He had walked into the county treasurer's office with cash in his pocket and walked out with a receipt that he had filed in the drawer where he kept his important papers. That receipt was in the house right now, proof that the notice was a lie. But the notice carried the weight of official authority. It had been issued by the county clerk's office, signed by Croft in his capacity as county administrator. And 60 days was not long to fight a legal battle when the other side controlled the machinery of the system. Samuel folded the notice and put it in his pocket. He walked to the house with the measured steps of a man who was holding himself together by sheer force of will. Sarah was in the kitchen, and she looked up when he came in. She saw his face, and her hands stopped moving. "What is it?" He handed her the notice. She read it, and the color drained from her face. "Samuel, it's a lie. I paid the taxes. I have the receipt." "I know you did, but this is official. It's Croft. He's using his position to manufacture a claim against the land." Samuel sat down at the table. His hands were flat on the wood, and he could feel the tremor in them that he was trying to suppress. 60 days. If we can't prove the payment within 60 days, they can start proceedings to take the property. Can we prove it? I have the receipt, but Croft is the county administrator. He controls the records. He could have removed the original payment from the ledger, or altered it, or claimed that I never made it. Sarah sat down across from him. She looked at the notice again, then set it aside. Then we fight. We go to Austin. We get Hargrove to challenge this in court. That takes time. And money. We have time. We'll find the money. Samuel looked at her. She was pale, but her eyes were steady. She had been through fire and flood and slander, and she was still standing. He reached across the table and took her hands. "I'm not going to lose this land," he said. "Not to them. You won't. We won't." They sat there for a moment, holding each other's hands, drawing strength from the contact. Then Samuel stood and went to the drawer where he kept his papers. He found the tax receipt exactly where he had left it, a small slip of paper with the county seal and the treasurer's initials. He held it in his hand, and it felt both like a shield and a fragile thing that could be taken away. He rode to Austin the next morning. He left before dawn, with the receipt in his pocket and a packed lunch that Sarah had pressed into his hands. The ride was long and hot, the spring sun climbing higher as the morning wore on, but he pushed his horse harder than he usually did. Time was not on his side. Hargrove was in his office when Samuel arrived, and the lawyer listened to the story with the same focused attention he had given every other crisis. He examined the receipt, then the notice, then sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "This is a problem," Hargrove said. "Not because you can't prove you paid, you can, but because Croft has positioned himself as the gatekeeper of the county records. If he's willing to manufacture a claim like this, he's willing to go further. What do you recommend?" "We file an immediate challenge in district court. We present the receipt as evidence. We request an injunction against any seizure proceedings until the matter is resolved." He paused. "But there's a complication." "What?" "The district judge for this region is a man named Thornton. He's been in office for 12 years, and he's up for re-election next year. Holt has been one of his biggest campaign contributors." Samuel's jaw tightened. "So the judge might not be impartial." "He might be. Thornton has a reputation for following the law, but he also has a reputation for remembering who helped him get where he is." Hargrove tapped his fingers on the desk. "I'll file the challenge. I'll request a hearing as soon as possible. In the meantime, I need you to gather every piece of documentation you have related to that tax payment. The original receipt, any correspondence with the treasurer's office, bank records, anything." "I'll bring it." "Good." Hargrove looked at him. "Samuel, I'm going to be honest with you. This is a long shot. Croft has been careful. He's left enough ambiguity in the notice to argue that it was a clerical error rather than deliberate fraud. If he plays it that way, the court might order a simple correction rather than punishing him for the attempt. And if it's a clerical error, the land is safe." "Yes, but Croft gets away with it, and he tries again with something else." Samuel thought about this. "Then we need to make sure he doesn't get away with it." "That's not our job. Our job is to protect your property." "Same thing." Hargrove studied him for a moment. "Be careful, Samuel. Holt and Croft have been playing this game for a long time. They know the rules better than you do. I know the land better than they do. That's what matters." Samuel rode back to the ranch with the weight of the fight pressing down on him. He had the receipt. He had a lawyer. He had a plan. But he also had the knowledge that the people he was fighting had resources and connections that he lacked. They were not fighting for survival the way he was. They were fighting for the pleasure of winning. He arrived home after dark. The house was lit, and he could see Sarah moving inside. The children were at the table doing their evening chores, and the sight of them, ordinary and alive, made something in his chest ache. He had built a life here. He was not going to let it be taken away. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. The district courthouse in Austin was larger than the one in Harlan, with high ceilings and oil lamps, and the smell of old paper and wood polish. Samuel sat at a table with Hargrove beside him. Across the aisle sat Croft, with a lawyer that Hargrove identified as a man named Rawlings, known for his skill at obscuring the truth behind a wall of procedure. Judge Thornton was a heavy-set man with a gray beard and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had learned that haste led to mistakes. He listened to the arguments without interrupting, his face giving nothing away. Rawlings spoke first. He argued that the tax notice was the result of an administrative error, that the county had experienced a change in record-keeping procedures, and that the notice had been issued in good faith, based on the information available at the time. He expressed regret for the inconvenience caused to Mr. Walker, and assured the court that the matter would be corrected as soon as the records could be reconciled. Hargrove rose to respond. He presented the receipt, the original document with the treasurer's initials and the county seal. He argued that the notice was not an error but a deliberate attempt to defraud Mr. Walker of his property. He requested that the court launch an investigation into the county's record-keeping practices, and that Croft be held personally accountable for issuing a notice based on false information. When Hargrove finished, the room was quiet. Judge Thornton looked at the receipt, then at Croft, then at the notice. "Mr. Rawlings," the judge said, "your client claims this was an administrative error, yet the notice bears his signature. It was issued under his authority. How do you explain the discrepancy between the receipt and the notice?" Rawlings shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, the county treasurer's office experienced a personnel change during the period in question. It's possible that the payment was recorded but not entered into the official ledger. Such errors are regrettable but not uncommon." "And the notice?" "Issued based on the ledger as it appeared at the time." Judge Thornton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Croft, do you have anything to add?" Croft stood. He looked at Samuel, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite triumph but close to it. "Your Honor, I acted in good faith based on the information available to me. If an error occurred, I regret it. But I assure the court that I had no intention of defrauding Mr. Walker." The judge nodded slowly. "I'm inclined to believe that this was an error rather than deliberate fraud. The receipt provided by Mr. Walker is clear and convincing. I hereby order the tax notice voided and the record corrected to reflect that Mr. Walker's taxes were paid in full." He paused. "However, I am also ordering the county to conduct a full audit of its record-keeping procedures to prevent such errors in the future. If any evidence of deliberate malfeasance comes to light, I will reopen this matter." He struck his gavel. "Case dismissed." Samuel sat still. He had won. The land was safe. But Croft had walked away without consequence, and the judge had stopped short of investigating the deeper corruption. It was a victory, but it tasted hollow. Hargrove leaned over. "It's not everything we wanted, but it's enough. The land is yours. For now." "For now is all we ever have," Hargrove said. "The trick is to make it last." Samuel rode home with the corrected papers in his pocket. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and the land stretched out before him, bruised but still his. He thought about what Hargrove had said. For now is all we ever have. He thought about Sarah, about the children, about the life they had built. He thought about Holt and Croft, who would not stop, who would find another angle, another way to try to tear it all down. And he thought about how tired he was, and how he could not afford to be tired, because the people who depended on him needed him to keep standing. When he reached the gate, Sarah was waiting for him. She was standing on the porch with Rose in her arms, and the lantern light behind her made her look like something out of a dream. He dismounted and walked toward her, and she saw his face and knew before he spoke. "We won," he said. She closed her eyes. Rose reached out and patted his cheek with her small hand. "Cowboy," she said, as if that explained everything. They went inside. The children were gathered around the table, and Samuel told them the news in simple words. Lily clapped her hands. Jacob pumped his fist. Ethan sat quietly, but his shoulders relaxed in a way that Samuel had learned to read. That night, after the children were asleep, Samuel and Sarah sat on the porch. The air was warm, and the stars were bright, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. "Samuel," Sarah said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "If we could leave tomorrow, if we could go somewhere else and start over, would you?" He thought about it. He thought about the land, his father's land, the land he had worked for 30 years. He thought about the house, the rooms that had been empty and were now full. He thought about the school, the children, the community. He thought about the fight. "No," he said, "this is where we belong." She nodded. "That's what I thought you'd say." "Is that what you want?" "I want what you want," she said. I want a place where our children can grow up safe. I want a life that doesn't require us to fight every single day. But I also know that the fighting is what made us who we are." She took his hand. "So I'll keep fighting, as long as you do." "Then we keep fighting." They sat in the dark, holding hands, and the night wrapped around them like a promise. The weeks that followed were quiet. The school finished its spring term, and Sarah held a small ceremony for the students, presenting each one with a certificate and a book from the library collection. The children from the neighboring farms brought gifts: wildflowers, a jar of honey, a hand-drawn card. One of the older boys, a shy 12-year-old named Thomas, who had struggled with reading, gave Sarah a letter he had written himself, telling her that she had taught him to believe in himself. Sarah cried when she read it. She put it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered most. Samuel worked the ranch, repairing the last of the flood damage and preparing for the summer. The cattle were healthy, the pasture was recovering, and the creek had settled into its normal course. Doss had taken over more of the daily operations, and Samuel found himself with time he did not know how to fill. He spent it with the children, teaching Jacob how to rope, helping Lily build a new shelf for her books, carrying Rose on his shoulders while she narrated the world from her elevated position. Ethan had changed. The boy who had stood with his arms spread wide, ready to fight the world, had begun to relax. He laughed more often. He argued with Jacob over chores the way brothers did. He helped his mother in the schoolroom without being asked. He had stopped watching the horizon for threats. Samuel noticed, and he was grateful. But the horizon still held threats, even if Ethan had stopped watching for them. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon in early June. It was addressed to Sarah, and it came from the State Board of Education in Austin. Samuel saw the return address and felt the familiar cold settle in his chest. He brought it to Sarah without opening it. She read it at the kitchen table, her face still. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him. "The State Board is conducting a review of all independent schools operating outside the county system," she said. "They're requiring every teacher to submit to a new certification examination by the end of August. If I don't pass, the school will be closed." "That's the same for everyone," Samuel said. "Yes, but the examination is administered by the county, and Croft is the county administrator." Samuel sat down. "He can't fail you if you pass the test. He can make it impossible to pass. He can change the location, the time, the format. He can make sure I don't know what's on the exam." She looked at him. "This is his new angle. He couldn't take the land, so he's going after the school." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Then we prepare, we study, we get every book we can find on the subject, and we make sure you know more than any examiner could ask." Sarah looked at him. "You think I can do it?" "I know you can." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then I'll do it. I'll study every night. I'll pass their test. And then I'll keep teaching until they find another way to try to stop me. And then I'll beat that, too." She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had been tested by fire and flood and found herself unbroken. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he said. They spent the summer preparing. Sarah studied in the evenings after the children were asleep, reading through books on pedagogy and child development and the history of education in the state. She wrote practice examinations and answered them. She quizzed Samuel on the material, and he did his best, though he admitted that most of it went over his head. The children helped in their own ways. Lily made flashcards. Jacob brought her coffee without being asked. Rose sat beside her with her own book, pretending to study, providing the quiet company of someone who believed that her mother could do anything. Ethan watched. He did not say much, but Samuel noticed that he had started studying too, reading the books his mother left on the table, learning the material alongside her. When Sarah asked him why, he shrugged and said, "I figured I should know what you know." Sarah did not cry, but she hugged him for a long time, and Ethan let her. The examination was scheduled for the last week of August. It was to be held in the county courthouse in Harlan, administered by a representative of the state board who would travel from Austin. Sarah received a letter confirming the date, time, and location, along with a list of topics that would be covered. She studied harder. The list was broad, but she had taught every subject on it. She knew the material. The only question was whether Croft would find a way to interfere. The morning of the examination, Samuel drove her into town himself. The children were left with Abigail Turner, who had insisted on keeping them for the day and plying them with enough food to see them through any crisis. Sarah was quiet on the ride, going over notes in her head, her hands folded in her lap. "You're going to do fine," Samuel said. "I know. I mean it. You know this material better than anyone." "I know." He looked at her. Her jaw was set, her eyes focused. She was not afraid, she was ready. He dropped her at the courthouse and waited outside on a bench in the shade. The morning passed slowly. He watched people come and go, watched the sun climb higher, watched the shadows shorten, and then begin to lengthen again. He thought about all the battles they had fought, and he wondered how many more there would be. The door opened at noon. Sarah walked out. Her face was unreadable. Samuel stood. He did not ask. He waited. She walked up to him, and then she smiled. "I passed." He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "How do you know?" "The examiner told me. He said I scored higher than any teacher he had ever tested." She laughed, a bright, unguarded laugh. "He said I should be teaching the exam, not taking it." Samuel pulled her into his arms. He held her there on the boardwalk, in front of the courthouse where Croft and Holt had tried to destroy her, and he did not care who saw. "Let's go home," he said. They rode back to the ranch together. The children were waiting at the gate, and when they saw their mother's face, they knew. Rose ran to her first, as she always did. Jacob was close behind. Lily was crying, which she would deny later. Ethan stood at the back, but he was smiling. That night they had a celebration. Abigail Turner had baked a cake. Calloway had sent a bottle of apple cider. The children stayed up late, playing games and laughing. Sarah sat on the porch with Samuel, watching them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's over," she said. Samuel looked at the children, at the house, at the land that had cost so much to keep. He thought about Holt and Croft, and how they would find another way, because men like that never stopped. But tonight, they had won. Tonight, the family was safe. He kissed the top of her head. "For now," he said. She did not ask what he meant. She knew. The stars came out one by one, and the night wrapped around them like a blanket. And somewhere in the dark, on the edge of the property, a figure stood watching the house. Not a threat, not yet. Just a presence, waiting. Samuel did not see him, but the horse in the barn shifted uneasily, and the dog that had been sleeping on the porch lifted its head and growled, low and deep, before settling back down. The battle was over, but the war was not. The summer heat settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, and the days stretched long and golden. Sarah's certification had been renewed, the school was preparing for its fall term, and the land had healed from the flood with the stubborn resilience of Texas earth. Samuel worked the fences with Jacob and Ethan, and in the evenings he sat on the porch with Sarah, watching the children play in the yard, feeling the simple weight of contentment settle into his bones. But the figure in the dark had not been a phantom. 3 nights after the examination, Samuel heard the dog growl. He had been sitting alone on the porch after Sarah had gone to bed, and the sound pulled him from his thoughts. He stood and walked to the edge of the yard, his hand resting on the pistol he had not carried in months. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was thin, middle-aged, with the stooped shoulders of someone who had spent too many years hunched over a desk. He wore a clerk's vest and carried a leather satchel. His face was pale in the moonlight. "Mr. Walker," the man said, "my name is Henry Jenkins. I work in the county treasurer's office." Samuel did not lower his hand. "What do you want?" Jenkins looked around as if afraid of being seen. "I need to talk to you, about Croft, about the taxes, about everything." Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. "Sit." Jenkins sat on the porch step. He opened his satchel and pulled out a ledger, its pages worn and stained. "I've been keeping records," he said, "off the official books. For 3 years I've been watching Croft alter tax records, forge signatures, redirect payments. I was too afraid to say anything. He has influence. He could ruin me." "Why are you here now?" "Because I heard what happened to you. The tax notice, the hearing. "I know you paid. I saw the receipt when it came in, and I saw Croft remove it from the ledger." Jenkins looked at Samuel with desperate eyes. "I have proof. Copies of the altered pages, testimony from other clerks. It's all here." Samuel looked at the ledger. "Why now?" Jenkins swallowed. "Because my daughter attends Mrs. Brooks's school. She's the one who struggled with reading. The one who wrote that letter. Thomas is my son." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. The shy 12-year-old boy who had written Sarah a letter of thanks, who had told her she taught him to believe in himself. That boy was Henry Jenkins's son. "She changed his life," Jenkins said. "She gave him hope. And I've been sitting on evidence that could help protect her, and I've been too scared to use it." His voice broke. "I'm done being scared." Samuel sat down on the step beside him. He looked at the ledger, at the proof of corruption that could finally bring Croft and Holt down. He thought about the long fight, the exhaustion, the cost. And he thought about the boy who had written a letter that made Sarah cry. "Tomorrow morning," Samuel said, "we ride to Austin, together." They left before dawn, Samuel, Jenkins, and the ledger. Sarah had wanted to come, but Samuel had told her to stay with the children. This was his fight now, the last one, and he intended to finish it. Hargrove met them at his office. He examined the ledger page by page, his face growing grimmer with each turn. When he finished, he looked at Jenkins with an expression that was not quite respect, but close. "This is enough," Hargrove said. "This is more than enough. Croft has been embezzling county funds, falsifying records, and abusing his authority for years. Holt has been his partner, using his position on the school board to steer contracts to Croft's associates. This will break them both." "How long?" Samuel asked. "I'll file the complaint this morning. The State Attorney General's office will take over from here. Given the weight of the evidence, they'll move quickly." He was right. Within a week, Croft was suspended from his position pending investigation. Within 2 weeks, Holt was removed from the school board. Within a month, both men were indicted on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of public office. The trial was held in Austin, away from the local influence that had protected them for so long. Samuel and Sarah attended every day. They sat in the front row, and they watched as witness after witness testified to the pattern of corruption that had poisoned the county for years. Jenkins testified first. He presented the ledger, explained the system of altered records, named the men who had helped Croft. Other clerks came forward, emboldened by Jenkins's courage. Parents whose children had been threatened by Holt's policies spoke about the pressure they had felt. Calloway testified about conversations he had overheard, deals that had been made in the back of his store. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Croft was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Holt received 3 years, with the understanding that he would serve time in a county facility. The judge looked at them as he pronounced the sentence, and he said, "You have betrayed the trust of the people you were sworn to serve. You have used your positions to harm the most vulnerable among us. This court finds no mercy in your actions and offers none in return." Samuel sat in the courtroom and listened to the gavel fall. He felt something release in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for so long that he had forgotten it was there. Beside him, Sarah was crying silently. He took her hand. "It's over," he said. She nodded. "It's over." They went home. The ride back to the ranch was long, but the sun was warm and the sky was clear, and the land that greeted them was the same land they had fought to keep. The children were waiting at the gate, and when they saw their parents' faces, they knew. The celebration that night was not loud. It was quiet, the way true relief often is. They sat on the porch, the whole family, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange and deep, peaceful blue. Rose fell asleep in Samuel's lap. Jacob leaned against his mother's shoulder. Lily was reading aloud from a book, her voice soft and steady. Ethan sat on the steps, looking out at the land, and Samuel saw in his profile the quiet confidence of a boy who was no longer afraid. The next morning, Samuel found Ethan in the barn. The boy was working on a piece of wood, shaping it with the careful attention he brought to everything he did. Samuel walked over and looked at what he was making. It was a sign, the same piece of cedar that Ethan had been carving months ago, before the flood, before the trial, before everything. The letters were deeper now, more sure, the work of hands that had learned patience. "Walker family," Samuel read aloud. "Built by love, not blood." "I finished it," Ethan said. He looked at Samuel. "I wanted to hang it today, if that's all right." Samuel looked at the sign. He looked at the boy who had stood with his arms spread wide, who had carried a photograph through fire, who had learned to trust again. He put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "That's more than all right," he said. They hung the sign together. Ethan climbed the gatepost and drove the nails in with the same careful precision he had used to carve the letters. Samuel held the post steady and watched. When it was done, they stepped back and looked at it. The rest of the family came out to see. Sarah stood beside Samuel, her arm around his waist. Lily was holding Rose's hand. Jacob was trying to see over everyone's head. They stood in a line, facing the gate, facing the sign that told the world who they were. "Well," Sarah said softly, "it's official now." "It's been official," Samuel said. "The sign just makes it visible." Rose tugged on his hand. "Cowboy," she said, "is that our name?" "It's our name," he said. She nodded, satisfied. "Good, I like it." Ethan stood apart, looking at his work. Samuel walked over to him. "You did good," Samuel said. Ethan looked at him. For a moment the old guardedness flickered in his eyes, the habit of a boy who had learned not to trust praise. Then it faded. "We did it," he said. "All of us." Samuel nodded. He looked at the sign, at the family standing behind it, at the land that stretched out before them. He thought about the long road that had brought them here, the fire and the flood and the courtroom, the moments of despair and the moments of unexpected grace. He thought about the drawing in his pocket, the one that said, "Now you are really family." He touched the place where it rested over his heart. "There's something I'd been meaning to give you," he said. He pulled out the tin box, the one he had run through fire to save. He opened it and took out the photograph of Thomas Brooks, the only one they had. He held it for a moment, looking at the face of the man who had been Sarah's husband, the father of these children. Then he handed it to Ethan. "I want you to have this," he said. "Your father was a good man. I never met him, but I know he was good because he raised you, and you should have his picture where you can see it every day." Ethan took the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. His hands were steady, but his eyes were bright. "Thank you," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you," Samuel said, "for teaching me what family means." The boy looked up at him, and then he did something he had not done since he was very small. He hugged Samuel. Not the forehead-to-chest press of the fire night, but a real hug, arms around the waist, face pressed into Samuel's shirt. Samuel wrapped his arms around him and held on. The family gathered around them. Sarah wrapped her arms around them both. Lily and Jacob pressed in from the sides. Rose climbed onto Samuel's back and hung there like a small, determined barnacle. They stood there, the six of them, held together by something stronger than blood. Biscuit the cat, who had been watching from the porch, walked over and sat at their feet, as if to say that he was part of this too. Samuel looked at the sign, "Walker family, built by love, not blood." He thought about the long years of silence and solitude, the nights he had spent alone in this house, believing that he was meant to carry his burdens by himself. He had been wrong. He had been so wrong, and he was grateful for the grace of being proven wrong. He thought about the frontier, about the people who had come before him, the ones who had built this land with nothing but their hands and their hope. He thought about what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself, not through inheritance, but through choice. The frontier spirit was not about conquering the land. It was about building a home, a community, a family, out of nothing but the will to love and protect. "Every trail has its hard stretches," he said, speaking to the family, to the land, to the listening dark. "Every life has its fires and floods. But the people who keep walking, who keep choosing each other, who keep building even when the building gets knocked down, those are the people who make the frontier worth crossing." He looked at Sarah, She was looking back at him, and her eyes were full of light. "Thank you," he said, "for choosing me." She smiled. "Thank you for being worth choosing." Rose, still hanging on his back, announced, "I choose you too, cowboy." Everyone laughed. The sound carried across the yard, across the pasture, across the land that they had fought for and won. The sun was setting, casting long shadows and painting the world in shades of gold. The sign on the gate caught the light, and the words shone like they had been carved in fire. They walked back to the house together. Samuel carried Rose on his back. Ethan walked beside him, still holding the photograph. Sarah had her arm through his. Lily and Jacob ran ahead, chasing each other in circles. Biscuit trotted behind them with the dignity of a cat who had accepted his role in the family. That night, after the children were in bed, Samuel and Sarah sat on the porch one last time. The stars were out, bright and close, and the air was warm with the memory of summer. "Are you happy?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about the years of silence, the years of emptiness, the years of believing that he was not worthy of love. He thought about the boy with his arms spread wide, the woman with her list of debts, the small hand on his leg, the drawing in his pocket. He thought about the sign. He thought about the photograph. "Yes," he said, "I am happy." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Me too." They sat in the dark together, and the night wrapped around them like a promise kept. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trail safe.